The candle flames wavered in the pre-dawn darkness of Lady Beatrice Fairfax's bedchamber, casting uncertain shadows across the immaculate room where everything had its designated place, each object arranged with the same meticulous precision that governed every aspect of her existence. It was 5 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in April of 1852, and Beatrice stood before her dressing-table mirror, as she had every morning for the past 3 years, her leather-bound notebook open beside her, filled with careful annotations and sketches documenting what she called her smile variations. The sympathetic smile occupied pages 3 through 7, complete with notes on the precise angle of the head tilt, the degree of eye softening required, and reminders that the expression must never linger too long lest it seem insincere. The polite interest smile filled the next section, with detailed observations about maintaining appropriate eye contact while ensuring the smile reached the outer corners of her eyes but traveled no further, creating an impression of attentiveness without the vulnerability of genuine engagement. The demure laugh, which she had been perfecting for the past 6 months, required the most technical precision. A gentle sound produced in the throat rather than the belly, accompanied by a hand placed delicately near the collarbone, the fingers never quite touching the skin, and a downward glance that suggested modest pleasure without actual joy. Agnes, her lady's maid who had served her since Beatrice was 13 years old, stood near the wardrobe watching this morning ritual with the same worried expression she had worn for 3 years, her weathered hands twisted together in her apron as she observed her young mistress transform her face through a series of carefully calibrated expressions, each one timed with a small clock on the dressing table. Beatrice lifted her chin slightly, studying her reflection with the critical eye of a sculptor examining marble, and began her practice with expression number 4, what she termed the pleasant morning greeting, which required the corners of her mouth to lift precisely 3/4 of the distance to a full smile, creating an impression of warmth without the messiness of actual emotion. The trick, she murmured to her reflection as she had countless times before, is to think of something pleasant while smiling. Not happy, mind you. Happiness shows in the eyes and seems false. Pleasant, mild contentment. The weather improving. A well-brewed tea. The satisfactory completion of household accounts. She demonstrated the expression, her face transforming with practiced ease into a mask of serene pleasantness that reached nowhere near her hollow grey eyes, which remained as carefully controlled as everything else about her appearance. Agnes shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the floorboards creaking softly in the silent room, and finally spoke with the careful deference required of her position, but with an underlying current of genuine concern that their long association permitted. "Miss," she said quietly, "it is not natural, hiding yourself this way. You are but 26 years old, and yet you conduct yourself as though feeling anything at all is a transgression against nature itself." Beatrice did not pause in her examination of expression number 7, the gracious acceptance of compliment, which required a slight widening of the eyes to suggest surprise, followed by a modest lowering of the gaze, before returning attention to the speaker with a smile that communicated gratitude without pride. "Natural feelings are a luxury I cannot afford," Beatrice replied, with the same calm composure that characterized all her speech, her voice modulated to never rise too high with excitement, nor sink too low with despair. "Our family's reputation depends on my composure, Agnes. You know this as well as I do. Mother has not been the same since Edmund died. Father retreats to his study and refuses to speak of it. Someone must maintain the appearance of normalcy, or we shall lose our standing entirely." She made a note in her journal, rating this morning's performance of the pleasant morning greeting as 8 out of 10, deducting points because she had detected a slight tremor at the corner of her mouth during the execution, a weakness that required additional practice. The room around them reflected Beatrice's internal architecture of control. The bed was made with hospital corners so precise they could have been measured with a ruler. The books on her shelf were arranged by height and color. Her writing desk contained exactly 3 pens arranged in parallel lines, and not a single item sat askew or out of place, as though the physical world could be organized into submission even when the emotional one could not. Through the tall windows that overlooked the fashionable streets of Mayfair, the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of pearl and rose, the gas lights along the street below still burning as the city slowly awakened to another day of rigid social performance, where everyone wore their designated masks and followed their prescribed roles. Beatrice turned to a fresh page in her notebook, one marked with yesterday's date, and reviewed her performance ratings from the previous day. Showed no distress when Mrs. Pemberton mentioned Edmund at the musicale, 9 out of 10, maintained appropriate sympathetic expression when Lady Whitmore discussed her daughter's upcoming nuptials. Despite my own lack of marital prospects, 8 out of 10, successfully deflected Aunt Catherine's intrusive questions about my emotional state with humor and grace. 7 out of 10, room for improvement in the steadiness of my voice. Agnes moved closer, her reflection appearing in the mirror behind Beatrice's shoulder, her lined face etched with a sorrow that came from watching a vibrant young girl transform herself into a carefully constructed automaton over the course of 3 years. "You were not always like this," Agnes said softly. And though it was not a question, Beatrice heard the unspoken plea within it, the desire to understand when and how her mistress had disappeared behind this elaborate facade. Beatrice met Agnes's eyes in the mirror for just a moment before returning her attention to her own face. And in that brief glance, Agnes saw something flicker in the depths of those grey eyes, some ghost of the girl who used to laugh with her whole body and cry without shame, and feel everything with an intensity that lit her up from within. "I was not always many things," Beatrice replied, her voice carrying no inflection whatsoever. "But we are not discussing who I was. We are discussing who I must be now, and who I must be now is someone who does not burden others with excessive displays of grief or allow personal tragedy to interfere with social obligations." She stood and moved to the window, her white nightgown ghostly in the growing light, and looked out at the awakening city, where thousands of other people were preparing to don their own masks and play their own roles in the great performance that was London society. 3 years ago, on a spring morning not unlike this one, her younger brother Edmund had convinced her to watch him practice jumps in the stable yard before the household awoke. He had been so excited about a new horse their father had purchased, a spirited bay gelding that Edmund swore would make him the finest rider in their set. Beatrice had stood at the fence, laughing at his enthusiasm, calling out encouragement as he urged the horse forward. And then, in one terrible moment that replayed in her mind every single day, the horse had balked at the jump, Edmund had lost his seat, and she had watched him fall in a way that even in that instant she knew was wrong. The angle all wrong, the sound when he hit the ground all wrong, everything suddenly and irreversibly wrong. She had run to him, her morning dress soaking up dew and mud as she knelt beside him, and she had held him while his breath came in shorter and shorter gasps, while his eyes clouded with confusion and fear, while the life left him there in the dirt with his older sister as his only witness to the end. At the funeral she had stood dry-eyed and composed because the shock had frozen something inside her, had locked away her ability to process what had happened, and she had overheard her Aunt Margaret saying to a cluster of relatives that at least Beatrice has the good grace not to make a spectacle of her grief. Such dignity in one so young, the family should be proud of her restraint. Something had crystallized in that moment, some terrible understanding that her pain was less important than her performance, that her value to her family lay not in her capacity to feel, but in her ability to not burden them with those feelings. And so she had made a decision there beside Edmund's grave. she had decided, that she would never make a spectacle of her grief. She would never burden anyone with her pain. She would lock it all away where it could not disturb the careful social order that governed their world. The notebook beside her on the dressing table contained 3 years of this discipline, 3 years of documented smiles and calculated expressions and rated performances, each entry a small brick in the wall she had built between her true self and the world that could not be trusted with that truth. Agnes brought her morning tea, the cup rattling slightly in the saucer as the older woman's hands shook with either age or emotion, and Beatrice accepted it with expression number 12, the grateful acceptance of service, which required a brief meeting of eyes, a small nod of acknowledgement, and a smile that conveyed appreciation without excessive warmth that might make a servant uncomfortable. The tea was perfectly prepared, as it always was, Agnes knowing without being told that Beatrice preferred it strong enough to taste the tannins, but with just enough milk to soften the bitterness. And Beatrice sipped it while reviewing today's schedule, which included a charity committee meeting at 10 o'clock, a fitting for a new walking dress at 2 o'clock, and dinner at Lady Whitmore's at 7 o'clock, each event requiring specific variations of her carefully practiced expressions. She would need the sympathetic concern expression for the charity meeting, where they would discuss the plight of orphans, the interested customer expression for the dress fitting, where she would need to appear pleased but not vain about her appearance, and the delighted guest expression for dinner, where she would be expected to socialize with eligible gentlemen her mother hoped might finally propose, despite Beatrice's advanced age of 26 and her complete lack of enthusiasm for marriage. The sun had fully risen now, painting her room in honest daylight that seemed almost accusatory in its brightness, illuminating every perfect surface and revealing the emptiness of such relentless order. And Beatrice turned from the window to begin the process of dressing for the day, each garment selected for its appropriateness to her schedule, each accessory chosen to convey the right impression, every detail of her appearance as carefully controlled as her facial expressions. Agnes helped her into her stays, pulling the laces with practiced efficiency, while Beatrice stood utterly still. And in the mirror, Beatrice caught sight of her own face in an unguarded moment, saw the hollow quality of her eyes, the tension around her mouth even in repose, the way she held herself with the rigid posture of someone braced against an invisible blow. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, someone Beatrice barely recognized, someone who had learned to exist without actually living. And for just a fraction of a second, something cracked in her carefully maintained composure, some small fissure in the armor she had so meticulously constructed. But then she caught herself, straightened her spine even further, and arranged her face into expression number 1, the neutral daytime countenance, which was not quite a smile, but rather a pleasant openness that invited no questions and offered no vulnerabilities. Today would be like every other day, a series of performances executed with technical precision, and if somewhere deep inside the locked chambers of her heart there was a girl still screaming with grief and rage and unbearable loneliness, well, that girl did not matter, could not be allowed to matter, because Beatrice Fairfax had made a promise to herself 3 years ago that she would never make a spectacle of her grief, and she had never broken a promise in her life. The grounds of Lady Whitmore's estate stretched across rolling hills dotted with ancient oaks, and on this particularly fine May afternoon, the gardens had been transformed into a paradise for the annual charity luncheon benefiting orphaned children, with striped tents erected on the lawn, tables laden with delicate sandwiches and pastries, and colourful bunting strung between the trees, creating an atmosphere of determined cheerfulness that seemed almost aggressive in its brightness. Beatrice Fairfax arrived precisely on time, as she always did, wearing a day dress of pale lavender that struck exactly the right note between fashionable and modest, her hair arranged in a style that was current, but not ostentatious. Every detail of her appearance, calibrated to present the image of a young woman of quality who understood her role in society's carefully choreographed performance. Lady Whitmore herself greeted the arriving guests with the particular enthusiasm of a hostess who had spared no expense in creating an event that would be discussed favorably in drawing rooms across London for weeks to come. And when she caught sight of Beatrice, she clasped her hands together with genuine pleasure and declared that she simply did not know what she would do without dear Beatrice's assistance, for everyone knew that Miss Fairfax had such a gift for organization and such a wonderfully steady temperament that made her invaluable at these affairs. Beatrice received this praise with expression number 18, the modest acceptance of compliment, which involved a slight lowering of her eyes, a small smile that suggested she was pleased but not proud, and a gentle deflection that turned attention back to the speaker, and she murmured something appropriately self-deprecating about merely being happy to be of service before moving efficiently into her assigned duties. The children began arriving shortly after, brought by the matrons of the foundling home in 2 large carriages, their faces scrubbed clean and their donated clothes pressed for the occasion, and Beatrice watched them tumble out onto the grass with the particular wariness of young souls who had learned not to trust in good fortune, lest it be snatched away. She had been tasked with organizing games and activities for the children, and she approached this responsibility with the same meticulous preparation she brought to everything, having planned a series of entertainments designed to occupy their attention while allowing the adult guests to enjoy their luncheon without the chaos of unsupervised children disrupting the carefully cultivated atmosphere of genteel charity. The other ladies gathered near the refreshment tent, their pastel gowns creating a watercolor wash of pink and blue and yellow against the green lawn, and Beatrice overheard their conversation as she directed the children toward the area she had designated for games. Mrs. Pemberton was saying to Lady Catherine that Miss Fairfax was truly a marvel, so wonderfully steady and never the slightest bit ruffled no matter what chaos erupted around her. And Lady Catherine agreed that it was quite remarkable how Beatrice managed to maintain such composure when so many young women of her generation seemed prone to excessive displays of emotion over the smallest inconveniences. Beatrice felt the familiar hollowness in her chest that always accompanied such praise, the recognition that what they admired in her was precisely what was killing her by inches, but she maintained expression number 4, the pleasant acknowledgement, and turned her attention to the children who were looking at the elaborate setup with a mixture of wonder and suspicion. She organized them into groups for various games, her voice gentle but firm, as she explained the rules for blind man's bluff and hunt the thimble, and she noted with the detached observation that characterized all her interactions that several of the children were approximately the age Edmund had been when he died, which created a peculiar ache in her chest that she ruthlessly suppressed. A small girl of perhaps 7 years approached her with the tentative steps of someone unaccustomed to seeking comfort from adults, and Beatrice knelt down to the child's level, arranging her face into expression number 23, the warm encouragement, which required softening her entire countenance and creating an impression of safe approachability. The child asked in a whisper if she might have a glass of lemonade, and Beatrice assured her that of course she could, and personally escorted her to the refreshment table, maintaining a stream of gentle conversation designed to put the shy child at ease, asking her name and her favorite color and whether she had ever been to such a grand estate before. The girl's name was Margaret, and as Beatrice poured lemonade into a crystal cup, Margaret said with the devastating directness of children that she missed her mamma. Something terrible, and wondered if perhaps her mamma could see her from heaven and know that she was at a fancy party. Beatrice's hands trembled so violently that lemonade sloshed over the rim of the cup, spattering drops across the white tablecloth like tears she would not shed, and for a terrible moment the careful control she had maintained all morning threatened to shatter entirely. She set down the pitcher with exquisite care using the moment to reconstruct her composure. And then she turned back to Margaret with a smile that felt like it might crack her face in half, and told the child that she was quite certain her mamma could see her and was very proud of what a brave girl she was being. Margaret accepted this assurance with a solemn nod and scampered off to join the other children, leaving Beatrice gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled intensity, her breath coming in careful, measured counts, 3 in and 3 out, the technique she had developed for managing moments when her emotions threatened to overwhelm the barriers she had so carefully constructed. She excused herself from the tent, murmuring something about checking on the arrangements for the storytelling session, and walked with measured steps toward the house, her smile never wavering even as her vision blurred slightly at the edges. Once inside, she found an empty parlor and crossed to the window, placing both hands on the sill and leaning forward, her forehead nearly touching the glass as she breathed with deliberate precision, counting each inhale and exhale, forcing her body back under control through sheer force of will. After precisely 3 minutes, she straightened, checked her reflection in the small mirror near the door, adjusted a curl that had escaped its pins, and returned to the garden with her pleasant expression perfectly restored. The luncheon proceeded with the clockwork precision of a well-planned social event, and Beatrice moved through her duties with the grace of long practice, organizing the children for a storytelling session where she read from a book of fairy tales with appropriate dramatic inflection that kept them entertained without becoming so animated as to seem undignified. When one small boy began to cry because the story reminded him of tales his deceased mother used to tell, Beatrice comforted him with practiced efficiency, her own eyes remaining dry and bright as she soothed his tears and distracted him with the promise of cake, all while maintaining the pleasant smile that had become her permanent expression. The ladies watching from their seats near the refreshment tent murmured approvingly about her natural way with children, and what a pity it was that she had not yet married, for she would make such an excellent mother, though of course at 26 her prospects were growing increasingly limited. It was during a brief respite when the children were occupied with their luncheon that Beatrice allowed herself to retreat to a quiet corner of the garden, a small alcove formed by a dense hedge that provided temporary sanctuary from the relentless cheerfulness of the event, and she stood there in the dappled shade, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles went white, her jaw clenched with the effort of maintaining control. For just a fraction of a second, she allowed her carefully constructed mask to slip, allowed the anguish she carried every moment of every day to show on her face, the grief and loneliness and bone-deep exhaustion of pretending to be someone she was not, and her features contorted with a pain so raw and profound that it transformed her entirely, stripping away the pleasant veneer to reveal the devastation beneath. She did not know she was being observed, did not realize that Sebastian Tilney, Duke of Ashford, had stepped into the garden at precisely that moment and witnessed the transformation, saw the naked suffering flash across her face before she took a shuddering breath and rebuilt her mask with visible effort, her features smoothing back into pleasant composure, as though the moment of anguish had never occurred. Sebastian had been standing near the house, having been strong-armed into attending this event by his mother, who believed that a duke of 38 years should participate in society, despite his well-known preference for his library and his academic pursuits. And he had been observing the proceedings with the detached interest of a scholar studying a foreign culture. He was a tall man with dark hair that refused to stay properly arranged, and eyes of such deep brown they appeared nearly black, and he dressed with elegant simplicity in dark colors that set him apart from the other gentlemen who favored the lighter shades deemed appropriate for afternoon events, his entire bearing suggesting someone who participated in society's rituals with polite tolerance rather than genuine enthusiasm. He had noticed Miss Fairfax almost immediately, not because she stood out, but precisely because she fit in so perfectly, moving through the crowd with such practiced grace that it had struck him as somehow performative, and he had found himself watching her with the same analytical attention he brought to his studies of human behavior. His shelves at home filled with works of ancient philosophy and modern psychological theory that explored the nature of emotion and the masks people wore to navigate social expectations. What he had observed troubled him, the way her smile never varied in intensity or quality, the mechanical precision with which she performed each social nicety, the subtle rigidity in her posture that suggested someone holding themselves together through force of will, and now this glimpse of the truth beneath the performance, confirmed his suspicion that Miss Fairfax was not the paragon of steady temperament that society believed her to be, but rather someone in profound distress who had become exceptionally skilled at hiding it. He approached her directly, having little patience for the elaborate social rituals that governed most interactions, and when he reached the alcove where she stood, her mask now firmly back in place, he spoke with the bluntness that had earned him a reputation for being somewhat difficult in social situations. "That smile," he said without preamble. "How long have you been wearing it?" Beatrice turned to face him with expression number 9, the polite confusion, which involved a slight tilt of the head and a gentle furrowing of the brow that suggested she had not quite understood the question and required clarification. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," she replied with perfect composure, her voice carrying just the right note of courteous inquiry. Sebastian did not return her smile, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her deeply uncomfortable, as though he were reading a text written in a language only he could understand. "Your smile," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. "It is exquisite. Too exquisite. No human being maintains such consistent pleasantness unless they are working very hard at it." Beatrice felt something cold settle in her stomach, the particular fear that came from being seen when one had devoted 3 years to remaining invisible, and she deployed expression number 15, the amused deflection, which required a light laugh and a dismissive gesture designed to make the questioner feel slightly foolish for their observation. "You mistake politeness for performance, Your Grace," she said, her tone suggesting gentle correction rather than offense. "I was raised to comport myself appropriately in social situations, nothing more." Sebastian shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving her face, and she had the unsettling sensation of being studied like one of the specimens in the Natural History Museum, pinned and labeled and examined for hidden truths. "No," he said quietly, his dark eyes serious and somehow sad. "I mistake nothing. I have spent my life studying human behavior, ancient philosophy, modern psychology, the ways in which people construct masks to protect themselves from a world that demands constant performance. And you, Miss Fairfax, are in pain, profound pain, and you are terrified of showing it." The accuracy of his observation struck her like a physical blow, and for a terrible moment she felt her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble, felt the 3 years of disciplined control threaten to collapse under the weight of being truly seen by another human being. But she rallied with the desperate strength of someone whose entire identity had become bound up in maintaining her facade. She drew herself up to her full height, arranging her features into expression number 27, the dignified dismissal, which required a cooling of her expression and a slight physical withdrawal that communicated the conversation had ended. "I appreciate your concern, Your Grace, but I assure you it is misplaced," she said with icy politeness. "Now, if you will excuse me, I must return to my duties with the children." She moved to step past him, but he did not move aside, his solid presence blocking her escape, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a gentleness that was somehow more devastating than his earlier directness. "I saw you," he said simply, "just now in this alcove. I saw your face when you thought no one was watching. I saw what you are carrying, and I understand why you hide it. But Miss Fairfax, the weight of such deception will destroy you if you continue to bear it alone. Beatrice felt tears threaten for the first time in 3 years, felt them burning behind her eyes like acid, and she blinked rapidly, deploying every technique she had developed to prevent their escape, her breath coming faster now, despite her efforts to control it. "You know nothing about me," she whispered, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. "Nothing at all." "Perhaps not," Sebastian conceded. "But I know what it looks like when someone is drowning in plain sight while everyone around them applauds their swimming technique. I know because I have seen it before. I have studied it in texts and observed it in life, and I am looking at it right now in your eyes." The sounds of the party drifted toward them over the hedge, children's laughter and adult conversation, the clink of crystal and the rustle of silk, all the bright, cheerful noise of London society performing its charitable duties, and Beatrice felt the enormous gulf between that world and the truth of her internal experience, felt the exhaustion of maintaining the bridge between them, and for just a moment she wanted nothing more than to collapse, to let this stranger, with his 2 seeing eyes, witness the full extent of her devastation. But 3 years of discipline held firm, 3 years of rated performances and practiced expressions, 3 years of proving to herself and her family and her world that she could bear anything without breaking, and she rebuilt her smile with visible effort, arranging her features back into pleasant composure, even as something in her eyes remained wild and desperate. "I must return to my duties," she repeated, her voice now perfectly controlled, and this time Sebastian stepped aside, allowing her to pass. But as she walked away, she felt the weight of his gaze following her, felt the terrible burden of being known by someone when she had worked so hard to remain unknowable, and she understood with sinking certainty that the Duke of Ashford had just become the most dangerous person in her carefully controlled world. The 2 weeks following the charity luncheon became a peculiar sort of torment for Beatrice Fairfax, as she discovered that Sebastian Tilney, Duke of Ashford, had apparently decided to make her his latest subject of scholarly inquiry, appearing at every social function she attended with the persistence of someone conducting research rather than engaging in the usual rituals of courtship. At the opera on Thursday evening, where Beatrice sat with her parents in their box, watching a particularly celebrated soprano perform arias from Mozart, she felt the weight of observation and turned to find the Duke in a box across the theatre, his opera glasses trained not on the stage, but directly on her face, studying her reactions with the focused intensity of a natural philosopher examining a specimen through a microscope. She immediately deployed expression number 11, the absorbed appreciation of art, which required her to turn her attention back to the performance with an appearance of such complete engagement that no observer could claim her mind wandered. But throughout the entire second act, she remained acutely aware of his scrutiny, feeling exposed in a way that made her skin prickle with anxiety. At dinner parties, he somehow always ended up seated near her, and rather than engaging in the usual pleasant small talk about weather and fashion and the latest society gossip, he asked questions that seemed designed to penetrate her carefully constructed defenses, his dark eyes watching her face with unnerving attention as he inquired what she feared most in this world, when she had last allowed herself to cry, what she would do with her time if no one was watching and she had no obligations to fulfill. Beatrice answered these invasive questions with practiced deflection, turning each one back to safer conversational territory with the skill of someone who had spent 3 years avoiding genuine emotional disclosure. But she could see in his expression that he recognized her evasions for what they were, could see him noting each deflection in whatever mental catalogue he was constructing of her psychological state. The constant surveillance made her increasingly anxious, her morning practice sessions with the mirror growing longer as she worked to perfect expressions that might withstand his analytical gaze. her journal entries becoming more detailed as she documented each encounter and rated her performance, always finding herself falling short of the flawless composure she demanded of herself. On Monday morning, a package arrived at the Fairfax townhouse, delivered by a footman in the Ashford livery, and when Beatrice opened it in the privacy of her bedchamber, she found a leather-bound book with gilt lettering on the spine that read, "On Grief and Melancholy," by a German philosopher whose name she did not recognize. Her hands trembled as she opened the cover to find that certain passages had been carefully underlined in pencil, sentences about the nature of suppressed sorrow and the psychological cost of unexpressed emotion, about how grief that is not permitted to flow outward will turn inward and poison the soul from within, about the difference between genuine healing and the mere performance of recovery. She read one marked passage that stated the individual who denies their pain does not transcend suffering, but merely drives it deeper into the architecture of the self, where it calcifies into something far more destructive than the original wound, and she felt a rage so pure and hot that it shocked her. This fury at being seen and analyzed and presumed to understand by someone who had known her for merely 2 weeks. She wanted to throw the book into the fire, wanted to send it back with a coldly worded note rejecting his presumptuous gift. But instead she found herself reading the underlined passages again and again, finding in them an uncomfortable recognition of her own internal experience that both validated and terrified her. The gossip began almost immediately, whispered conversations in drawing rooms about whether the Duke of Ashford was courting Miss Fairfax, speculation about what such an alliance might mean given his considerable wealth and ancient title compared to her respectable but unremarkable family position, observations that the Duke had never shown sustained interest in any woman during his 15 years as an eligible bachelor, and what could possibly account for his sudden attention to a woman of 26 with no particular beauty or fortune to recommend her. Beatrice's mother heard these whispers and responded with barely contained excitement, suddenly taking intense interest in her daughter's social schedule and appearance, insisting that Beatrice wear more fashionable gowns and arrange her hair in more becoming styles, and perhaps smile a bit more warmly when the Duke was present, advice that struck Beatrice as bitterly ironic, given that the Duke seemed to be the one person in London who actively disliked her smiles. Lady Fairfax began engineering situations where Beatrice and the Duke would be thrown together, accepting invitations to events she knew the Ashford family would attend, inviting the Duke's mother for tea, and ensuring Beatrice was present to serve refreshments, creating a pressure that made Beatrice feel increasingly trapped between her mother's expectations of perfect performance and the Duke's disturbing insistence on seeing through that performance to the broken thing beneath. At the Moorland Ball on Saturday evening, where the cream of London society gathered in a ballroom decorated with thousands of white roses and illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast everything in a flattering golden glow, Beatrice found herself pursued across the crowded floor by the Duke, who seemed utterly indifferent to the speculation his attention was generating. She had successfully avoided him for the first hour by maintaining constant motion, accepting dance after dance with various gentlemen who seemed increasingly aware that they were serving as shields against the Duke's approach. But eventually she needed to rest and retreated to the conservatory that adjoined the ballroom, a glass-enclosed space filled with exotic plants that provided temporary refuge from the oppressive crowd. She had been standing among the ferns for perhaps 3 minutes, breathing in the humid air and trying to calm the anxiety that had been building all evening, when his voice came from behind her, quiet but unmistakable in the relative silence. "Of the conservatory. You cannot avoid me forever, Miss Fairfax," Sebastian said, and she turned to find him standing near the door, his dark evening clothes making him appear almost menacing in the dim green-filtered light that came through the glass walls. Beatrice deployed expression number 27, the dignified dismissal, keeping her voice cool and her posture erect as she replied that she had not been avoiding him. She had simply been occupied with other social obligations, a statement they both knew was a complete fabrication. He moved closer, and she had the unsettling sensation of being cornered, though he maintained a perfectly respectable distance and made no threatening gestures, his danger lying entirely in his words and his two-seeing eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, abandoning pretense for a moment in her desperation to understand his motivations. Why this relentless observation and these intrusive questions and that book with its terrible underlined passages? What do you want from me? Because watching you slowly disappear behind that smile is like watching someone drown in plain sight, he replied with devastating directness. And everyone is applauding your drowning technique, calling it grace and composure and admirable restraint. And I cannot stand by and join that applause when I can see what it is costing you. His words struck something deep inside her, some part of herself she had worked so hard to bury, and she felt her carefully maintained control beginning to fracture, felt 3 years of disciplined repression threatening to explode outward, and she fought it with every technique she had developed, breathing in careful counts and mentally rehearsing her practiced expressions and reminding herself that feelings were a luxury she could not afford. "You do not know anything about me," she said, her voice tight with the enormous effort of staying calm, of not screaming or weeping or collapsing under the weight of his accurate observations. "You have constructed some narrative in your mind based on fragmentary observations and philosophical texts, but you know nothing of my actual circumstances or feelings or choices." Sebastian moved closer still, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, close enough that his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper as he said, "I know you have forgotten what your real smile looks like. I know you practice expressions in the mirror each morning before dawn. I know that you rate your daily performances in a journal using a numerical system. Agnes mentioned it to my valet, who mentioned it to me. I know that 3 years ago your brother died, and something inside you died with him, and you have been performing the role of a living person ever since without actually allowing yourself to live." Beatrice went pale, her carefully maintained composure cracking visibly as fury and terror warred within her, the invasion of her privacy feeling like a violation, profound that she could barely form words. "You have no right," she began, her voice shaking now despite her best efforts to control it. "No right to investigate me like some subject of academic study. No right to discuss me with servants or send me books or presume to understand my internal experience based on your scholarly readings about human psychology. I have every right to care when I see someone suffering." Sebastian interrupted, his voice gentle now, almost tender in a way that made her want to weep. Every right to extend compassion to another human being who is clearly in distress regardless of how skillfully she hides that distress from the rest of the world. "I am not suffering," Beatrice insisted, deploying the lie she had told herself and others 1,000 times. "I am perfectly well. I am managing my life with appropriate dignity and fulfilling my social obligations with grace. There is nothing wrong with me that requires your concern or intervention." "That," Sebastian said softly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away, "is the saddest lie I have ever heard. And I have heard many lies in my 38 years, but none quite so heartbreaking as watching you insist that your slow self-destruction is actually wellness." The sounds of the ball drifted toward them through the conservatory door, music and laughter and the rustle of silk, all the bright noise of society performing its endless rituals. And Beatrice felt the disconnect between that world and this moment, felt the dangerous intimacy of being truly seen by another person after 3 years of studied invisibility, and something in her wanted to surrender to it, to let this persistent man with his philosophical books and his uncomfortable questions witness the full extent of her devastation. But 3 years of discipline was not so easily abandoned. 3 years of proving to herself and her family that she could bear anything without breaking. And she rebuilt her defenses with visible effort, arranging her features into expression number 13, the polite conclusion of conversation, as she informed him that she appreciated his concern, but it was entirely misplaced, and she would thank him not to pursue this topic further. She moved to step past him, to return to the safety of the crowded ballroom, where she could lose herself in the performance of social obligations. But he spoke again, and his words stopped her in her tracks. "Your brother would not want this for you," Sebastian said quietly. "This half-life you are living, this endless performance of composure, while the real Beatrice Fairfax slowly suffocates beneath the mask. Surely he would want you to grieve him honestly, and then find your way back to actually living, rather than merely existing." The mention of Edmund shattered something in her carefully maintained control, and she spun to face him with the first genuine emotion she had allowed herself to show in 3 years. Her face, contorted with a pain so raw and furious that it transformed her entirely. "You dare to speak of my brother," she said, her voice low and shaking with barely suppressed rage. "You dare to presume what he would want when you never knew him, never saw his smile or heard his laugh or held him while he died in the mud, because you are not the one who failed to save him. You are not the one who has to live with that failure every single day." There it was, the truth she had never spoken aloud, the belief that underlay all her careful control, that she had somehow been responsible for Edmund's death, and therefore had no right to her own grief or pain or needs, that her role was to hold her family together through their loss, even as she crumbled under the weight of her own. Sebastian's expression shifted, something like understanding and sorrow crossing his features as he absorbed her confession. And when he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that threatened to undo her completely. "You could not have saved him," he said simply. "It was an accident, a terrible tragedy, but not your fault, not your failure, and you do not honor his memory by destroying yourself with guilt and unexpressed grief." Beatrice felt tears threatening for the second time in as many weeks, felt them burning hot behind her eyes as 3 years of frozen sorrow began to thaw under the heat of his compassion. But she had spent too long perfecting her control to let it slip now, in a conservatory at a ball where anyone might walk in and witness her collapse. She blinked rapidly, deployed her breathing techniques, and forced the tears back through sheer willpower, rebuilding her pleasant mask even as her hands trembled and her breath came in ragged gasps. "I must return to the ballroom," she said, her voice barely steady. "My mother will be looking for me." And she fled before he could respond, fled back into the bright noise of the ball, where she could hide among the crowd, where she could lose herself in the familiar rhythms of social performance, and pretend that the Duke of Ashford had not just seen straight through to the guilty, grieving, utterly broken core of her being. For the rest of the evening, she maintained her pleasant expression with grim determination, dancing and conversing and performing all the rituals of her role with mechanical precision. But she remained acutely aware of Sebastian's presence at the edge of the ballroom, his dark eyes following her with an expression that looked disturbingly like concern mixed with resolve, and she understood with sinking certainty that he had no intention of abandoning his unwanted pursuit of her truth, that he would continue to push and probe and question until either she broke completely or until she found some way to make him stop seeing her with such devastating clarity. Wednesday mornings had become sacred to Beatrice Fairfax in the 3 years since Edmund's death, a weekly pilgrimage to the cemetery on the outskirts of London, where her brother lay beneath a simple marble headstone that bore his name and dates and the inscription, "Beloved son and brother," a phrase that seemed woefully inadequate to contain the entirety of who he had been. She rose before dawn each Wednesday, dressing in the darkness without waking Agnes, choosing somber greys and blacks appropriate for mourning, though she no longer wore full mourning attire in her daily life, her family having decreed after the first year that extended mourning was excessive, and she should return to normal colours and activities lest she appear morbid. The carriage ride through the sleeping city took 30 minutes, passing through streets still lit by gas lamps, while the sky gradually lightened from black to deep blue to the pale grey of approaching dawn. And Beatrice sat in the darkness of the carriage, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly, with each mile that carried her away from the watchful eyes of society toward the one place where she could let her mask slip without consequences. The cemetery gates were always unlocked at dawn for early visitors, and she walked the familiar path to Edmund's grave through rows of headstones that marked the final resting places of thousands of London souls, the ground soft beneath her feet from morning dew, mist hanging low over the grass and curling around the marble monuments, like spirits reluctant to depart. Edmund's grave sat beneath an old oak tree, a location their father had chosen because Edmund had loved to climb trees as a boy, and Beatrice had brought a small gardening kit in her reticule with which she tended the flowers she had planted around the base of his headstone, primroses and violets that required weekly care to keep them flourishing. She knelt in the damp grass, heedless of the moisture soaking through her skirts, and began to pull weeds with methodical care, her hands working while her mind drifted to memories of her brother, his laugh that had been too loud for drawing rooms, his enthusiasm for horses and hunting, and all the active pursuits that had made him so vibrant and alive. This was the only place and time where Beatrice allowed herself to drop the pleasant mask she wore constantly in society. The only hour each week where she permitted her face to relax into its natural grief, letting the sorrow show in the downward curve of her mouth and the heaviness of her eyes, and the way her whole countenance seemed to collapse under the weight of loss. She did not cry, had not cried since the funeral 3 years ago, when something inside her had locked up tight and refused to release tears no matter how much pain pressed against that internal dam. But she let the sadness be visible without fighting it, let her face show the truth of what she carried every moment of every day beneath her practiced expressions. She spoke to Edmund as she tended his flowers, telling him about the absurdities of London society and the exhausting performance of her daily life, and how much she missed him with an ache that never diminished no matter how much time passed, her voice soft in the quiet morning air where only the birds could hear her confession. She told him about the Duke of Ashford and his unsettling attention, his questions that pierced too close to the truth, and his philosophical books with their uncomfortable observations about grief. And she found herself admitting to Edmund's headstone what she could never admit to any living person, that sometimes she was so tired of performing composure that she fantasized about simply walking away from her life, disappearing into some anonymous existence where no one knew her and no one expected anything from her, and she could finally stop pretending to be fine. The mist was beginning to lift as the sun rose higher, golden light filtering through the oak leaves above Edmund's grave, and Beatrice sat back on her heels, her hands dirty from the soil, her face utterly unguarded as she gazed at her brother's name carved in marble. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She turned, expecting to see the cemetery groundskeeper making his morning rounds, and instead found Sebastian Tilney, Duke of Ashford, standing 10 feet away with his hat in his hands and an expression of such profound sorrow on his own face that for a moment they simply stared at each other, two people caught in the rawest moments of their grief. Beatrice felt something inside her shatter, felt the violation of her one safe space, her one private moment, pierce through her like a physical wound, and she saw in his eyes that he was seeing her completely unmasked for the first time. seeing the naked grief on her face and the dirt on her hands, and the way her whole body seemed to curve inward around the pain she carried. She scrambled to her feet, her pleasant mask nowhere within reach, her practiced expressions completely abandoned in the face of this intrusion, and she felt a fury so pure and desperate that it propelled her past him without a word, running down the gravel path toward the cemetery gates with her skirts clutched in her dirty hands, and her breath coming in gasping sobs that were not quite crying, but were closer to tears than she had come in 3 years. Sebastian did not follow, did not call after her or try to stop her flight, and she was dimly aware that his restraint was a gift, but she was too overwhelmed to feel anything but the desperate need to escape, to get away from his witnessing eyes and back to the safety of her locked bedchamber, where she could rebuild her defenses without an audience. The carriage ride home passed in a blur of panic and rage, her mind racing with the implications of his presence at the cemetery. The realization that he must have known about her Wednesday visits, must have planned to be there at that precise time, must have deliberately invaded her sanctuary with the same relentless determination that characterized all his pursuit of her truth. By the time she reached the Fairfax townhouse, she had managed to arrange her features into something approximating composure, though her hands still trembled and her breathing remained unsteady, and she slipped through the quiet house to her bedchamber, where Agnes found her an hour later, sitting perfectly still on the edge of her bed, staring at nothing, her dirt-stained skirts still damp with dew. Agnes helped her change without asking questions, her weathered hands gentle as she unfastened buttons and unlaced stays, and Beatrice was grateful for the maid's discretion, for the way Agnes had learned over 3 years not to probe at wounds that would not heal. The rest of that Wednesday passed in a haze of mechanical performance as Beatrice moved through her scheduled activities with even more rigidity than usual, her smiles brittle and her responses to conversation slightly delayed, and more than one person commented that she seemed not quite herself, asking if perhaps she was coming down with something. Her mother suggested she rest, looking at her with the vague concern of someone who noticed symptoms but had no interest in diagnosing causes, and Beatrice assured her that she was perfectly well, just slightly fatigued, deploying expression number 32, the reassurance of health, which required a brightening of the eyes and a small laugh to dismiss worry. That evening, a note arrived delivered by a footman in Ashford livery, and Beatrice opened it with shaking hands to find Sebastian's distinctive handwriting covering a single sheet of cream-colored paper. "Forgive my intrusion," the note read. "I understand the need for sanctuary. I have been visiting my father's grave on Wednesday mornings for 2 years, seeking the same privacy and space for unguarded grief that you seek at your brother's resting place. I did not know you would be there, and I would not for anything have violated your one safe space. I will visit my father on Tuesdays henceforth. Wednesdays belong to you and Edmund. You have my word that I will not intrude again." Beatrice read the note 3 times, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the words, and she felt something shift in her chest, some small crack in the armor she had built so carefully around her heart. No one in her entire life had ever prioritized her actual needs over their own convenience or desires. No one had ever witnessed her pain and responded not with demands for explanation or expectations of immediate recovery, but with simple respect for her boundaries and her grief. She wanted to maintain her fury at him, wanted to cling to her outrage at his invasion of her cemetery visits. But the gesture of giving up his own Wednesday mornings, his own established routine of mourning, struck her as so profoundly kind that she could not sustain her anger in the face of it. She learned from careful questioning of her mother over tea the next day that Sebastian's father had died 2 years ago quite suddenly from a heart condition, leaving Sebastian to inherit the dukedom at the age of 36, when he had been quite content as a younger son pursuing his academic interests without the burden of title and responsibility. Her mother mentioned with the casual cruelty of someone who did not consider how her words might land that the late Duke had been quite disappointed in Sebastian's scholarly pursuits and lack of interest in society, that there had been considerable tension between them in the years before the old Duke's death, and Beatrice understood with sudden clarity that Sebastian carried his own complicated grief, his own unfinished business with a parent who had died before reconciliation could occur. The following Wednesday, Beatrice woke before dawn as usual, but could not bring herself to make the journey to the cemetery, could not bear the thought of returning to that space now that it had been witnessed by another person, now that her private grief had been seen and her unguarded face had been observed in its natural sorrow. She stayed in her bedchamber, pacing restlessly while Agnes watched with worried eyes, and by the time the sun had fully risen, Beatrice felt the loss of her weekly sanctuary like a physical ache, the one outlet for her grief now closed to her by her own inability to return to a place that had been contaminated by another's presence. Without that weekly release, even the limited and tearless release of letting her face show her sadness for 1 hour, Beatrice found her control becoming increasingly brittle, her practiced smiles requiring more effort to maintain, her journal entries noting with clinical detachment that her performance was slipping, that she was rating herself lower and lower each day as the strain of constant composure without any outlet began to show. In subtle ways she could not quite suppress. At a musicale on Friday evening, she found her hands shaking so badly during a conversation about nothing of consequence that she had to clasp them together to hide the tremor. And at a garden party on Sunday, she excused herself 3 times to private spaces where she could grip window sills and breathe in careful counts, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm her careful control. Several ladies commented with the false concern that characterized so much of society's interest in others' misfortunes that perhaps Miss Fairfax was working too hard on her various charitable committees, that she seemed rather strained lately, and perhaps she should consider reducing her obligations and taking more time for rest. Beatrice assured them all with expression number 17, the dismissal of concern with gratitude, that she was perfectly well and merely adjusting to the change of seasons, but privately she knew that losing her cemetery sanctuary had cost her more than she had realized, had removed the one pressure valve that had allowed her to maintain her rigid control in all other areas of her life. On the second Wednesday after the encounter at the cemetery, Beatrice woke at her usual early hour and found herself dressed and ready to leave before she had consciously decided to go, her body moving through the familiar ritual while her mind remained uncertain. She hesitated at the door of her bedchamber, her hand on the brass handle, torn between her desperate need for that hour of unguarded grief and her fear of encountering Sebastian again, of having her private sorrow witnessed by eyes that saw too much. Finally, the need outweighed the fear, and she made her way to the waiting carriage, arriving at the cemetery just as the first light touched the tops of the headstones and turned the morning mist golden. She walked the familiar path with her heart pounding, half expecting to find Sebastian there despite his promise. But the cemetery was empty, except for the birds singing their dawn chorus, and when she reached Edmund's grave, she found it exactly as she had left it, except for one addition. On top of Edmund's headstone sat a small, leather-bound book, and when Beatrice picked it up with trembling hands, she found it was a volume of poetry, Wordsworth's collected works, and tucked inside the front cover was a note in Sebastian's handwriting that read only, "For the Wednesdays when words fail, sometimes another's words can help. These poems brought me comfort in my own grief. Perhaps they might do the same for you. The book is yours to keep, or to leave here as you prefer. I will not intrude on your Wednesdays again." Beatrice sank down beside Edmund's grave with the book clutched to her chest, and for the first time since that terrible day 3 years ago, when she had watched her brother die, she felt something begin to thaw in the frozen center of her being, some small crack in the ice that had encased her heart. And though still no tears came, she sat in the morning light reading Wordsworth's verses about grief and loss and the terrible beauty of remembering those we love. And she understood that Sebastian Tilney, Duke of Ashford, had just offered her something far more valuable than romance or courtship or any of the things society assumed he was pursuing. He had offered her simple human compassion, the recognition of her pain without demands that she explain it or overcome it or perform recovery for his comfort, and that unexpected gift left her feeling more vulnerable and more seen than she had felt in 3 long years of careful hiding. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning over breakfast, when Lady Fairfax set down her teacup with the decisive click of someone who had made an important decision and declared that she would be hosting a grand ball on the 23rd of May, a date that meant nothing to her, but that sent ice through Beatrice's veins, because it was exactly 3 years to the day since Edmund had died. Her mother continued speaking with the oblivious enthusiasm of someone planning a social triumph, outlining her vision for an event that would re-establish the Fairfax family's position in society after 3 years of subdued mourning, explaining that she expected Beatrice to assist with every detail of the planning, while of course maintaining her usual charitable obligations and social engagements, and Beatrice sat frozen in her chair, her practiced smile fixed in place, while her mind screamed with the memory of another ball 3 years ago, the last ball their family had hosted at their country estate, the night Edmund had stepped out to check on his new horse and never returned alive. Her father said nothing, merely retreated further behind his newspaper, his habitual response to anything that might require emotional engagement, and Beatrice understood with terrible clarity that her mother had either forgotten the significance of the date or had deliberately chosen it as some misguided attempt to replace a terrible memory with a happier occasion, and neither possibility offered any comfort. She heard herself agreeing to help with the planning, heard her own voice deploying expression number 5, the enthusiastic cooperation, as she assured her mother that of course she would be delighted to assist, and she watched herself begin to fracture from a distance, as though she were observing someone else's slow disintegration. The following weeks became a descending spiral of mounting pressure and failing control as Beatrice threw herself into the ball preparations with desperate energy, filling every moment of every day with tasks and obligations and activities that left no space for thought or feeling or the terrible awareness that she was approaching the anniversary of the worst day of her life. She met with florists and musicians and caterers. She reviewed guest lists and seating arrangements. She oversaw the ordering of new linens and the polishing of silver, and all the while she maintained her pleasant expression, even as she felt something inside her beginning to crack under the strain. Her sleep, which had never been particularly restful since Edmund's death, deteriorated further until she was averaging perhaps 3 hours a night, lying awake in the darkness with her mind racing through endless lists of tasks, while her body trembled with exhaustion it could not release. The nightmares, when sleep finally came, were always the same. Edmund falling from his horse in an endless loop, his body hitting the ground with that terrible sound, his eyes finding hers with confusion and fear, and she would wake gasping and drenched in sweat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs, and she would light a candle and practice her expressions in the mirror at 3 in the morning, rating herself harshly for the shadows under her eyes and the strain visible in the corners of her mouth. Agnes begged her to rest, to cancel some of her obligations, to take even one day to simply be still and recover, some small measure of strength, but Beatrice refused with increasing sharpness, her usual gentle manner with servants giving way to snapped commands and irritable corrections that left Agnes looking wounded and worried. "If I stop," Beatrice said one morning when Agnes had been particularly insistent, "if I slow down, if I let myself feel it, And then she could not finish the sentence because the truth was too terrible to speak aloud, that she was terrified if she stopped moving for even a moment, she would collapse completely and never find the strength to rise again. Her practiced smiles, which she had perfected over 3 years of dedicated effort, began to fail her even by her own exacting standards, reaching her lips but traveling nowhere near her eyes, the muscles of her face trembling with the effort of maintaining expressions that no longer came naturally but had to be forced into being through sheer will. She noted this deterioration in her journal with clinical detachment, rating herself lower and lower each day, writing observations like "Smeset Mrs. Pemberton's joke about her unmarried state," managed to maintain expression for full duration of conversation, but detected slight tick at corner of left eye, 5 out of 10, significant room for improvement, unacceptable performance. Several people commented that she looked tired, that perhaps she was taking on too much with the ball planning, and she deflected their concern with practiced ease while privately acknowledging that she was indeed taking on too much, but had no idea how to stop, how to extract herself from the momentum of constant activity that was the only thing standing between her and complete collapse. Sebastian watched her deterioration with visible alarm, his presence at social events no longer feeling like intrusive observation, but rather like concerned surveillance, and she would catch his dark eyes following her across crowded rooms with an expression that looked distressingly like worry mixed with helpless frustration. At a garden party on the 15th of May, 8 days before the anniversary ball, Beatrice found herself snapping at a servant who had arranged the tea service slightly incorrectly, her voice sharp and her criticism excessive, and she looked up to find Sebastian watching her from across the lawn, his face grave, and she felt a flush of shame at being witnessed in a moment of such poor control. She excused herself and retreated to the house, seeking a private room where she could regulate her breathing and rebuild her composure. But her hands were shaking so badly she could not manage the simple task of smoothing her skirts, and she stood gripping the back of a chair while her vision blurred at the edges and her breath came in shallow gasps that never quite filled her lungs. The musicale on the 20th of May, 3 days before the anniversary, became the breaking point toward which she had been spiraling for weeks. Lady Morland had arranged an evening of musical performances by various talented young ladies, and Beatrice had been specifically requested to play pianoforte, an invitation she could not refuse without causing offense, and generating exactly the sort of speculation she had spent 3 years avoiding. She sat in the drawing room with the other guests while several young women performed creditably on harp and voice, and she felt the familiar disconnect between her body sitting calmly in the chair and her mind screaming with mounting panic as the moment of her own performance approached. When Lady Morland called her name, she rose with expression number 24, the modest acceptance of invitation to perform, which required a slight hesitation, as though surprised to be asked, followed by gracious acquiescence, and she moved to the pianoforte with steps that felt mechanical, as though her legs belonged to someone else and were being operated by strings she could not quite control. She settled onto the bench and arranged her skirts with automatic precision, her hands hovering over the keys while she considered what to play. And in a moment of self-destructive impulse she could not later explain, she chose a Chopin nocturne that Edmund had particularly loved, that he used to ask her to play on quiet evenings when it was just the two of them, and no performance was required, when she could pour genuine feeling into the music without fear of judgment. Her fingers found the opening notes, and for perhaps 30 seconds she played with mechanical accuracy, her face arranged in expression number 19, the absorbed musician, which required a slight furrowing of the brow and a distant focus that suggested complete engagement with the art. But then the melody reached the section Edmund had loved best, the part where the left hand created a gentle rolling accompaniment, while the right hand sang out with almost unbearable sweetness, and she felt memory crash over her with physical force. Remembered Edmund sitting in the chair by the window, listening with his eyes closed and his face peaceful. Remembered the last time she had played this piece was 2 days before his death. Remembered him asking her to play it again, and her refusing because she was tired and wanted to retire early. And oh God, the last time he had asked her for something she had said no, had denied him this small pleasure. And now he was dead, and she would never have another chance to play this piece for him, or do anything else for him ever again. Her hands began to tremble. At first just a slight vibration that made the notes uncertain. But then the shaking intensified until her fingers could not reliably find the correct keys, producing discordant sounds that rang harsh in the suddenly quiet room. She tried to push through, tried to force her rebellious body back under control, but the trembling spread from her hands to her arms to her entire torso, her breath coming in gasps that she could not suppress, her vision blurring, as 3 years of unshed tears pressed against the backs of her eyes with crushing pressure that she still could not, would not release. The music stopped, her hands frozen above the keys, and the silence in the drawing room was absolute, every eye fixed on her with the avid attention of society witnessing someone's public humiliation. Beatrice stood with mechanical precision, turning to face the assembled guests, and she deployed expression number 31, the gracious apology for minor social error, which required a small, self-deprecating smile and a light tone that suggested the incident was of no consequence whatsoever. A momentary fatigue, she said, her voice somehow steady, despite the way her entire body shook with tremors she could not control. Please forgive the interruption. I fear I have been working too hard on the preparations for our ball. Perhaps someone else might favor us with a performance. She walked toward the door with measured steps, each one requiring enormous concentration to place her feet correctly, to maintain her upright posture, to keep her pleasant expression in place despite the fact that she could feel herself fragmenting into pieces that she did not know how to reassemble. The guests parted before her in a whisper of silk and a rustle of fans, their faces showing various degrees of concern and curiosity and barely concealed delight at the unexpected drama. And Beatrice made it through the doorway and down the hall and out into the garden before her legs began to give way beneath her. She reached a secluded corner near the rose arbor, far enough from the house that the lights from the windows barely reached, and she stood absolutely rigid with her fists clenched at her sides and her jaw locked so tight it sent pain radiating through her skull, fighting with every technique she had developed over 3 years to maintain some semblance of control while her body betrayed her with violent trembling and gasping breaths that sounded dangerously close to sobs. She heard footsteps on the gravel path and knew without looking that it was Sebastian, could recognize now the particular rhythm of his gait and the way he moved through space with quiet assurance. And some part of her wanted to order him away, while another part, a part she had been denying for weeks, felt desperate relief that he had followed, that she did not have to be alone in this moment when everything was finally falling apart. He said nothing at first, merely stood a respectful distance away, close enough that she could feel his presence, but far enough that she did not feel cornered, and his silence was somehow more supportive than any words could have been, a simple witnessing without demands. "Let it out," he said quietly after a long moment, his voice barely audible over the sound of her ragged breathing and the distant music that had resumed inside the house. "No one is here but me. You do not have to perform for me. You have never had to perform for me." "I cannot," Beatrice whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her. "If I start, I will never stop. If I let it out, it will destroy me. There is too much, and it has been locked away too long, and if I open that door even a crack, everything will come pouring out, and I will drown in it." "Is that what you think?" Sebastian asked, his tone gentle but pressing. That grief is a flood that will drown you, that your feelings are so dangerous they must be kept locked away or they will kill you. I know it will, she said, her voice breaking on the words. And then something inside her cracked further, and the truth she had never spoken aloud came pouring out in gasps and fragments. I saw him die. Your Grace, I was there. I heard the crack of his neck when he hit the ground. I held him while he stopped breathing. I watched the light leave his eyes, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing. I could not save him. I could not help him. I could only kneel in the mud and hold him while he died, and if I let myself remember it, truly remember it and feel it, if I let myself acknowledge what I lost and what I failed to prevent, I will collapse. My family needs me to be strong. My mother falls apart at the mention of his name. My father hides in his study and refuses to speak of Edmund at all. Someone has to hold us together. Someone has to maintain some appearance of normalcy, or we will all fragment into nothing. And you decided it should be you, Sebastian said softly. At the cost of yourself, you decided that your grief matters less than theirs, that your pain is less important than their comfort, that your needs can be sacrificed to maintain their equilibrium. I am not important enough to cost anything, Beatrice said. And with those words, she revealed the core wound that underlay all her careful control, the fundamental belief that her own suffering was irrelevant compared to everyone else's, that her value lay in her ability to absorb pain without showing it rather than in her inherent worth as a human being deserving of care and support. The night air moved around them, carrying the scent of rose and the distant sound of music and laughter from the house where the musicale continued without her. And Beatrice stood in the darkness, feeling more exposed than she had ever felt in her life, having just confessed truths she had never articulated even to herself, having just revealed the terrible mathematics by which she had calculated that her pain mattered less than her performance of composure. Sebastian moved closer, still maintaining respectful distance, but near enough now that she could see his face in the dim light from the distant windows, could see an expression of such profound sorrow and compassion that it threatened to undo what remained of her control. Your pain matters, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Your grief is as valid and as important as anyone else's. You are not less valuable because you witnessed his death. You are not less deserving of care because your mother cannot cope with her loss. You are not required to sacrifice yourself on the altar of your family's emotional dysfunction. And the fact that you believe otherwise, the fact that you have been destroying yourself for 3 years under the mistaken belief that your suffering is irrelevant, is perhaps the greatest tragedy in this entire situation. Beatrice felt something give way inside her, some final barrier crumbling under the weight of his words and the unbearable kindness in his voice. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt the tears begin to come, felt them building behind her eyes with a pressure that was both terrifying and relieving, felt the ice that had encased her heart begin to crack and splinter. But 3 years of discipline was not so easily abandoned, and she fought the tears with desperate strength, blinking rapidly and deploying her breathing techniques and clenching her fists until her nails bit into her palms hard enough to draw blood, anything to stop the flood that threatened to overwhelm her, anything to maintain the control that had become her entire identity. I have to go back inside, she said, her voice shaking but still somehow controlled. I have to return to the musicale. My absence will be noted. People will talk. I cannot afford to be the subject of gossip. I cannot. And she moved to step past him, but found her legs would not quite support her weight, found herself swaying slightly as exhaustion and emotional overload finally caught up with her body's desperate attempt to maintain control. Sebastian caught her arm gently, steadying her, and his touch was so careful, so respectful of her boundaries even in this moment of crisis, that it made her want to weep with gratitude for his restraint. "You do not have to go back inside," he said quietly. "I will make your excuses. I will tell them you were feeling unwell and I saw you safely to your carriage. No one will question a duke's word. You can go home and rest, and you do not have to perform for anyone tonight." "But the ball," Beatrice protested weakly. "There is so much left to prepare. The florist needs final approval on the arrangements. The musicians require confirmation of the program. I cannot simply abandon my responsibilities." "The ball can wait," Sebastian said firmly. "Your health cannot. You are exhausted and overwrought, and if you do not rest, you will collapse entirely, and then you will be of no use to anyone, least of all yourself." Beatrice wanted to argue, but found she had no strength left for it, found that all her carefully constructed defenses had finally crumbled under the combined weight of sleep deprivation and approaching anniversary and the terrible scene at the pianoforte, and she allowed Sebastian to guide her around the side of the house to where the carriages waited, allowed him to speak quietly to her driver and see her settled inside, allowed herself for just this one night to accept help from someone who saw her struggling and offered support without demands or judgment. As the carriage pulled away from the moorland house, carrying her through the dark London streets toward home, Beatrice sat in the darkness and felt the full weight of how close she had come to complete breakdown, how thin the margin was between the control she had maintained for 3 years and the chaos that threatened constantly beneath the surface, and she understood with terrible clarity that she could not continue this way, that something fundamental had to change, or the anniversary ball in 3 days would be the occasion of her final and complete unraveling before all of London society. The morning after the disastrous musicale, Beatrice woke after perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep to find Agnes drawing back the curtains with unusual hesitance, her weathered face showing an expression that Beatrice had learned to recognize as the harbinger of unwelcome news. "His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, has called," Agnes said quietly. "He is waiting in the drawing-room and has requested a private audience with you. Your mother is already down there, and quite beside herself with excitement. She believes he means to make an offer." Beatrice felt her stomach drop, felt panic rise in her throat at the thought of facing Sebastian so soon after last night's humiliating breakdown, after she had stood in the garden and spilled truths she had never meant to speak aloud, after he had seen her trembling and barely able to stand, and had witnessed the full extent of her unraveling. She wanted to refuse, to send word that she was indisposed, but 3 years of social training overrode her personal desires, and she found herself allowing Agnes to dress her with mechanical efficiency, choosing a morning gown of pale blue that she hoped made her look less exhausted than she felt, though no amount of powder could disguise the dark shadows beneath her eyes or the hollowness in her cheeks that had developed over the past weeks of poor sleep and mounting stress. She descended the stairs with measured steps, practicing expression number 4, the pleasant morning greeting, though her reflection in the hall mirror showed her that the expression was failing even by her drastically lowered standards, her smile reaching her lips but traveling nowhere near her eyes, which looked flat and dead despite her best efforts to animate them. The drawing-room was precisely as she remembered from 1,000 previous social calls, with its formal furniture arranged in conversation groupings, its chandelier catching the morning light and scattering it across the pale carpet, its atmosphere of rigid propriety that made genuine conversation nearly impossible, and yet when she entered and found Sebastian standing by the window in his dark coat with his hat in his hands, something about his presence made the formal space feel somehow more intimate, as though they had created between them a small island of truth in a sea of performance. Her mother sat on the settee near the fireplace, her face arranged in an expression of barely suppressed delight, her hands folded in her lap with the forced patience of someone who believed she was about to witness her daughter receive a proposal from one of England's most eligible bachelors, and Beatrice felt a wave of exhaustion at the irony that her mother thought this visit was about courtship. When Beatrice knew with terrible certainty that it was about something far more uncomfortable, about Sebastian's relentless pursuit of her truth, and his unwillingness to let her destroy herself in peace. "Good morning, Your Grace," Beatrice said, deploying her practiced greeting with automatic precision. "What an unexpected pleasure! To what do we owe the honor of your visit?" Sebastian's dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, and she saw in his expression a determination that suggested he had come here with a specific purpose and would not be deterred from it regardless of her attempts at deflection. "Miss Fairfax," he said, his voice formal but carrying an underlying warmth that belied the proper words. "I apologize for the early hour, but I found I could not wait to speak with you about a matter of some importance, with your mother's permission, of course, as propriety demands." Lady Fairfax practically glowed with anticipation, gesturing graciously for Sebastian to continue while positioning herself near enough to serve as chaperone, but far enough to suggest she was granting them privacy, and Beatrice wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, at her mother's complete misunderstanding of the situation, but she had no laughter left in her, had used up all her emotional resources last night in the garden, and had nothing remaining but a hollow exhaustion that made even standing upright feel like an enormous effort. "I wanted to share with you," Sebastian began, and then he paused, seeming to choose his words with unusual care. "A story from my own experience, something I have spoken of to very few people, but which I believe may be relevant to your current situation, if you will permit me the liberty of such candor." Beatrice felt her practiced mask slip slightly, felt confusion replace the pleasant composure she had been maintaining, because this was not the opening to a proposal that her mother clearly expected, and she found herself genuinely uncertain about what Sebastian intended, found herself almost curious despite her exhaustion. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, sitting in the chair her mother indicated, while Sebastian remained standing, his tall frame backlit by the morning sun coming through the window. "When my father died 2 years ago," Sebastian said, his voice taking on a quality of careful control that suggested he was working to maintain his own composure while discussing difficult truths, "I believed that the appropriate response was to continue immediately with my ducal duties, to step into the role he had. Left vacant without pause for grief or adjustment, I attended Parliament sessions the week after his funeral, I managed estate business and tenant concerns. I fulfilled every social obligation and professional responsibility without allowing myself to acknowledge the loss I had sustained." His hands, which had been still at his sides, now moved to clasp behind his back, and Beatrice noticed the gesture, recognized it as the same sort of physical control she employed when fighting to maintain composure. "I believed," he continued, "that stoicism was strength, that the ability to function without visible emotion was a measure of character, that grief was something to be overcome through sheer force of will and dedication to duty. And for 6 months I maintained this belief, performing my role as Duke while remaining completely numb to everything I was feeling, or rather everything I was refusing to feel." Beatrice felt something shift in her chest, felt an uncomfortable recognition of her own patterns in his description, and she leaned forward slightly despite herself, her practiced expression forgotten in genuine attention to his words. "6 months after my father's death," Sebastian said, his voice dropping lower, "I collapsed. Not a graceful decline or a gradual deterioration, but a complete and sudden physical and mental breakdown that left me unable to rise from my bed, unable to speak coherently, unable to perform even the most basic functions of daily life. My physician confined me to bed rest for 3 weeks and told my household that if I did not begin to actually process my grief instead of denying it, I would likely die from the strain I was placing on my body and mind." Lady Fairfax made a small sound of sympathetic concern, though her expression suggested she was somewhat confused about why the Duke was sharing such personal information in what she had assumed would be a courtship conversation. But Beatrice could not look away from Sebastian's face, could see in his eyes the shadow of that experience, could recognize the vulnerability it required for him to share this story. "I learned," Sebastian continued, meeting Beatrice's gaze directly, "that unfelt grief does not disappear. It does not fade or diminish through being ignored. Instead, it burrows into your bones and makes you ill. The body keeps score, even when the mind refuses to count. And all the emotion I had tried to suppress found expression through physical symptoms I could not control." He brought his hands forward then, holding them out palm up so she could see them clearly, and Beatrice noticed for the first time a slight tremor in his fingers, barely visible but unmistakable once observed. "My hands developed this tremor during that time," Sebastian said quietly, "and it returns whenever I am under significant stress or when I am trying to suppress emotion rather than acknowledging it. It has become a permanent reminder that I cannot think my way out of feeling, that grief demands to be felt regardless of how inconvenient or inappropriate that feeling might seem." The drawing room was absolutely silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock, and Beatrice found she could not deploy any of her practiced expressions, could not arrange her face into pleasant composure or polite interest or any of the masks she had perfected, could only sit frozen in her chair, stints at this man who had just laid bare his own breakdown in what she was beginning to understand was an act of profound generosity, an offering of his own vulnerability to create space for hers. "I do not want you to break the way I did," Sebastian said, his voice gentle now, almost tender. "You deserve better than to shatter alone the way I did, better than to push yourself until your body forces you to stop, because your mind will not grant you permission to feel what you are feeling." "Why do you care?" Beatrice heard herself ask, the question escaping before she could stop it. "You barely know me. Why does my well-being matter to you at all?" Sebastian was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his words carried a simplicity that made them more powerful than any elaborate declaration. "I know what it is like to lose yourself," he said, "to look in the mirror one day and not recognize the person staring back, to realize you have become so skilled at performing a role that you have forgotten who you actually are beneath the performance. And I know that you deserve to be found, not by me necessarily, but by yourself. You deserve the opportunity to discover who you are when you are not constantly managing everyone else's emotions and maintaining an appearance of composure that is slowly killing you." Beatrice felt tears threatening again, felt them pressing hot behind her eyes as they had last night in the garden, and she blinked rapidly, deployed her breathing techniques, fought them back with desperate strength because she could not, would not cry in her mother's drawing room, with her mother watching and Sebastian bearing witness. "I do not know if I want to be found," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The woman I was before Edmund died. She died with him. This version of me, this performance, as you call it, is all I have left. It is the only thing standing between me and complete dissolution. Then perhaps," Sebastian said gently, moving closer but still maintaining respectful distance, "it is time to meet who you are becoming. Not who you were and not this performance you have constructed for survival, but who you actually are beneath all of it. Who you might be if you gave yourself permission to feel and heal and discover yourself again." He paused, and Beatrice saw him gather himself, as though preparing to make an offer he was uncertain she would accept. "Come to Ashford Manor," he said, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made looking away impossible. "Stay for a fortnight. No society, no obligations, no expectations of performance or composure. Just space to be. Whatever you actually are. Space to grieve without judgment. Space to discover who you might become if you stopped sacrificing yourself to maintain everyone else's equilibrium. Lady Fairfax made a small, delighted sound, clearly interpreting this invitation as a courtship gesture of significant seriousness, and Beatrice saw her mother's face transform with barely suppressed excitement at the prospect of her daughter spending 2 weeks at a ducal estate. But Beatrice understood with perfect clarity that Sebastian was not offering courtship. He was offering sanctuary. He was offering her what he had not had during his own breakdown, a safe space to fall apart without the pressure of constant observation and social expectation. "I cannot possibly," Beatrice began, her voice weak with exhaustion and confusion and the terrible temptation of what he was offering. "The ball is in 3 days. My mother needs my help with the preparations. I have obligations and responsibilities that cannot simply be abandoned." "The ball can be managed without you," Sebastian said firmly. "Your mother has servants and can hire additional help if needed, and your obligations to yourself are far more important than your obligations to host a social event. You are on the edge of complete collapse. Miss Fairfax, I saw it last night. I have been watching you deteriorate for weeks, and if you do not take time away from the pressure of performing for London society, you will break entirely, and then you will be of no use to anyone." Beatrice wanted to argue, wanted to deploy all her practiced deflections and polite refusals, but she was so tired, so desperately tired of holding herself together, and the offer of 2 weeks away from watchful eyes and constant performance sounded like the most beautiful thing anyone had ever offered her, even as it terrified her completely. "What if I do not know how to feel anymore?" she whispered. "What if I have locked it all away for so long that I cannot access it even when I want to? What if I have become this performance so completely that there is nothing real left beneath it?" "Then we will discover that together," Sebastian said quietly. "And if there is nothing left, we will build something new. But I suspect that beneath your practiced smiles and your rated expressions and your mechanical composure, there is a woman who feels everything very deeply and who has been drowning in unexpressed emotion for 3 years. And I suspect that if given space and permission and witness without judgment, that woman might find her way back to the surface." Lady Fairfax, who had been listening with increasing confusion as the conversation strayed further and further from her expectations of a courtship proposal, finally spoke up with a voice that tried for delighted support while betraying underlying bewilderment. "What a generous offer, Your Grace," she said. And of course Beatrice would be delighted to accept. Such a wonderful opportunity to become better acquainted with Ashford Manor. I am sure a fortnight in the country will do her good. She has been working so hard on the ball preparations, a rest is just what she needs. Beatrice looked at her mother and saw the complete failure of understanding, saw that Lady Fairfax had interpreted Sebastian's offer through the lens of her own desires and expectations, believing this to be a courtship gesture rather than what it actually was, a rescue attempt, and the irony struck her as almost unbearable that her mother wanted her to go to Ashford Manor to perform perfect courtship behavior while Sebastian wanted her to go precisely so she could stop performing entirely. She looked back at Sebastian and found him watching her with patient intensity, clearly willing to wait for her answer, clearly prepared to accept whatever decision she made without pressure or manipulation, and that respect for her autonomy, that willingness to offer help without demanding she accept it, was perhaps the most compelling argument for going. "I will need to consider," Beatrice began, but Sebastian shook his head gently. "The ball is in 3 days," he said, "which means you have approximately 72 hours before the anniversary of your brother's death, before you will be required to host hundreds of guests in your home and maintain perfect composure while internally screaming with grief. And I do not believe you have 72 hours of control remaining. I believe you are much closer to breaking than even you realize." His bluntness should have offended her, but instead it felt like relief, like someone finally naming the truth she had been trying so hard to hide. And she felt something inside her make a decision before her conscious mind had fully processed the implications. "I will come," she heard herself say, her voice stronger than she expected. "I will come to Ashford Manor for a fortnight, but I make no promises about what will happen there. I make no guarantees that I will suddenly transform into someone capable of healthy emotional expression. I may simply maintain my composure in a different location." "That is acceptable," Sebastian said, a small smile touching his lips for the first time since entering the drawing room. "You may maintain whatever composure you wish. You may spend the entire fortnight practicing expressions in the mirror if that is what you need. The only requirement is that you give yourself space away from the pressure of London society and the approaching anniversary. Everything else is negotiable." Lady Fairfax immediately began making plans with the enthusiasm of someone orchestrating what she believed was a courtship, discussing travel arrangements and appropriate chaperonage, and what Beatrice should pack for a fortnight at a ducal estate. And Beatrice sat numbly in her chair, listening to her mother organize her escape, while Sebastian watched her with an expression that somehow managed to convey both concern and hope. And she understood that she had just agreed to something that would either save her or destroy her completely, and she had no idea which outcome was more likely. The journey to Ashford Manor took 4 hours by carriage, carrying Beatrice away from London through countryside that grew increasingly wild and beautiful as they travelled west into Hampshire, and she sat in the well-appointed vehicle with her mother's elderly cousin, Mrs. Gardiner, serving as chaperone, watching the landscape transform from manicured estates to rolling hills dotted with ancient trees, feeling with each mile a curious mixture of relief at escaping the city and terror at what awaited her in this self-imposed exile. Mrs. Gardiner, blessedly, was hard of hearing and preferred her own thoughts to conversation, which meant Beatrice could maintain silence without seeming rude, could watch the passing scenery while her mind raced with questions about what she had agreed to, what Sebastian expected from this fortnight, what she herself hoped to gain or feared to lose in this strange sanctuary he had offered. Ashford Manor revealed itself gradually as the carriage wound up a tree-lined drive, first a glimpse of honey-coloured stone through the foliage, then the full, sprawling edifice emerging in all its understated grandeur, a Jacobean structure of 3 stories with mullioned windows that caught the afternoon light and extensive gardens that showed evidence of being allowed to grow somewhat wild, nature permitted to assert itself in ways that formal London gardens never allowed. Sebastian met them in the entrance hall, flanked by a small household staff that seemed remarkably sparse for an estate of this size, and Beatrice noticed immediately that he had chosen to keep the atmosphere quiet rather than impressive, more country house than ducal showcase, and she felt something in her chest loosen slightly at the lack of formal ostentation. He greeted Mrs. Gardiner with courteous warmth, and then turned to Beatrice with an expression that managed to convey welcome without pressure, his dark eyes searching her face as though checking for signs of imminent collapse. "I hope the journey was not too taxing," he said, his voice carrying genuine concern beneath the polite words. "Your rooms overlook the rose garden, and I have arranged for your favorite tea to be available at all hours, but otherwise you should consider yourself completely without obligations for the duration of your stay. Your time is entirely your own to use as you see fit." Beatrice deployed expression number 8, the grateful guest, which required a warm smile and a slight inclination of the head, and she heard herself thanking him with practiced grace while internally cataloguing the exits and private spaces she might use when her control inevitably failed. The housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50 with kind eyes and an efficient manner, showed Beatrice to her assigned chambers, a suite of rooms decorated in soft greens and creams that managed to feel both elegant and comfortable, and through the tall windows Beatrice could see the rose garden Sebastian had mentioned, an expanse of carefully cultivated chaos where roses of every color bloomed in profusion alongside lavender and climbing jasmine, the whole effect more cottage garden than formal parterre. On the writing desk, she found a small stack of books with a note in Sebastian's handwriting that read simply, "Thought these might interest you. No obligation to read them. Just options if you find yourself wanting distraction." And when she examined the volumes, she found a mix of novels and poetry and one slim volume of essays about grief by various philosophers, all chosen with clear attention to her potential interests and emotional state. The first 3 days at Ashford Manor passed in a strange, suspended quality, as though Beatrice had stepped outside of normal time into some liminal space where the usual rules did not quite apply. She maintained her pleasant smile and her practiced expressions, playing the role of perfect guest with the same dedication she brought to all her performances, appearing punctually for meals and making polite conversation and expressing appropriate appreciation for the beauty of the estate and the graciousness of her host. Sebastian, true to his word, created no expectations for her time, often leaving her alone for hours while he attended to estate business or retreated to his library. But she would find small gestures of thoughtfulness throughout the day, a pot of her preferred tea appearing in the drawing room just as she entered, a lap blanket left on her favorite chair in case she felt chilled, books appearing and disappearing from the table near the window as though he were silently offering options for her entertainment. He never asked how she was feeling, never pressed her to talk about Edmund or her grief or anything of emotional consequence, instead engaging her in conversations about books and philosophy and the management of roses, topics that allowed for genuine engagement without requiring vulnerability. On the evening of the 3rd day, they sat in the library after dinner, Mrs. Gardiner having retired early with a headache, and Sebastian read aloud from Wordsworth while Beatrice pretended to work on embroidery she had no interest in completing. And the domesticity of the scene struck her as both comforting and deeply strange. This quiet companionship with a man who had appointed himself guardian of her breakdown without ever explicitly naming it as such. That night, Beatrice lay in her comfortable bed listening to the sounds of the countryside filtering through her open window, the call of night birds and the rustle of wind through trees, sounds so different from the constant noise of London that they emphasized how far she had traveled from her normal existence, and she felt anxiety building in her chest like a physical pressure. The anniversary of Edmund's death, now only hours away, the date she had been dreading for weeks, finally arrived. She tried to sleep, but her mind would not quiet, racing through memories of that terrible morning 3 years ago. The sound of hoofbeats as Edmund rode toward the jump, the sickening crack of impact, the desperate moments kneeling in the mud while his life drained away beneath her hands. And she felt her breath coming faster, felt her heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake her entire body, felt the familiar signs of the panic that had been her constant companion for weeks. At some point near 4 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely and dressed in the darkness, choosing a simple morning gown that required no assistance from a maid, and she slipped out of her room and down the stairs and out through the French doors that led to the rose garden, seeking air and space and some relief from the crushing pressure in her chest. The garden was beautiful in the pre-dawn darkness, the roses reduced to shapes and shadows, their perfume heavy in the still air, and Beatrice walked deeper into the planted beds until she found herself in the very center of the garden, where a small stone bench sat surrounded by climbing roses that formed a natural bower. She sat down on the cold stone and tried to deploy her breathing techniques, counting in for 3 and out for 3, but her breath kept catching on something in her throat, some obstruction that made proper breathing impossible, and she realized with distant surprise that she was making small sounds, gasping noises that were almost sobs, but not quite. And then suddenly, without conscious decision, the dam that had held for 3 years simply broke. The crying started as a trickle, tears sliding down her face while she remained otherwise still. But within moments it became a flood. Huge gasping sobs that tore out of her chest with such violence that they bent her double, her hands clutching at her stomach as though she could physically hold herself together against the force of grief that was finally being released. She cried for Edmund, for the brother she had lost, and the future he would never have. Cried for the last 3 years of performed composure and suppressed emotion. Cried for the girl she had been before that terrible morning, and the woman she had tried so hard not to become. The sobs were ugly and loud and completely beyond her control, nothing like the delicate tears acceptable in polite society. These were the raw sounds of animal grief, wordless and devastating. And she could not stop them even when her stomach began to heave, even when she made herself physically sick in the roses, even when her throat went raw and her eyes swelled and her face became a ruin of mucus and tears. She had no idea how long she cried, time losing all meaning in the face of such overwhelming emotion. But gradually she became aware of light filtering through the rose bower, realized that dawn had broken while she wept. And she became aware, too, of a presence. Nearby, looked up through swollen eyes to find Sebastian sitting on the ground, perhaps 6 feet away, his back against a tree, his face grave and gentle as he watched her fall apart. She wanted to feel humiliated, wanted to deploy some practiced expression to cover her devastation, but she had nothing left, no defenses remaining, no masks available, just the raw truth of her grief laid bare in the morning light. "I do not know how to stop." She gasped between sobs, her voice wrecked and barely recognizable. "It has been locked away so long. I do not know how to make it stop." "Then do not stop," Sebastian said quietly, his voice steady and calm in contrast to her chaos. "Cry until you are empty. Cry for as long as it takes. I will wait. I am not going anywhere." "You will think me weak," Beatrice said, the words tumbling out between gasping breaths. "You will see this and know I am not strong at all, that I have been pretending for 3 years, and underneath the pretending there is only this, only broken pieces and endless grief." "Beatrice," Sebastian said, and something in the way he spoke her name, firm and sure and carrying absolute conviction, cut through her spiraling panic. "I have watched you hold yourself together with nothing but willpower for months. I have seen you maintain composure while internally screaming. I have witnessed the enormous strength it requires to suppress emotion as completely as you have. And this," he gestured to her tears and her ruined face and her shaking body, "this is the bravest thing I have ever seen you do. This is not weakness, this is courage. This is you finally allowing yourself to feel what you have needed to feel for 3 years." His words struck something deep inside her, some fundamental belief about her own worthlessness that had sustained her performance for so long, and she felt it crack under the weight of his conviction that her tears represented strength rather than failure. She cried harder then, if such a thing were possible, cried until she was empty of everything, until no more tears would come, and she was left hollow and exhausted, and somehow lighter than she had felt in 3 years. The sun had fully risen by the time she finally went quiet. The rose garden bathed in golden morning light. Petals scattered on the ground around them like evidence of necessary destruction, and Sebastian had not moved from his position against the tree, had simply borne witness to her complete unraveling without trying to fix it or stop it or make it easier. He produced a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it across the space between them, and Beatrice took it with trembling hands, pressing the soft linen to her swollen face and trying to clean herself up, though she suspected she looked absolutely hideous. "There," Sebastian said softly. That is real. That is true. That is you actually feeling what you have been carrying. And there is nothing shameful in it, nothing weak, nothing that requires apology or explanation. I must look hideous, Beatrice said, her voice hoarse from crying, utterly destroyed and completely inappropriate. You look human, Sebastian replied, his dark eyes gentle. You look like someone who has finally allowed herself to grieve instead of performing strength. You look alive in a way you have not looked since the day I met you, and I have never seen anything more beautiful than your willingness to finally be honest about your pain. Beatrice felt something shift in her chest, some fundamental recalibration of how she understood herself and her grief, and she looked at this man who had pursued her truth with such relentless determination, who had offered her sanctuary without expectations, who had sat on the ground in his garden at dawn, bearing witness to her complete breakdown without judgment or demands, and she felt gratitude so profound it threatened to bring fresh tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not trying to stop me, for not telling me it would be all right, or offering empty comfort, for just being here and letting me finally fall apart. I told you," Sebastian said, rising to his feet and brushing dirt from his trousers. "I know what it is like to break alone, and I did not want that for you. You deserve to have someone bear witness to your pain, someone who can hold space for your grief without trying to fix it or rush you through it." He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Beatrice took it, allowing him to help her to her feet, though her legs felt weak and uncertain beneath her. She was acutely aware of how she must look, her face swollen and blotchy, her hair coming loose from its pins, her dress stained with tears and dirt. But for the first time in 3 years, she did not immediately reach for a practiced expression to cover her dishevelment, did not deploy any mask to hide the evidence of her emotional state. They walked back to the house in silence, Sebastian maintaining a respectful half-step behind her, as though giving her space to process what had just happened, and when they reached the French doors leading to the breakfast room, he paused. "You should rest today," he said gently. "Grief is exhausting work, and you have just done 3 years' worth in a single morning. I will have breakfast sent to your room, and you can sleep or read or simply be still. There are no expectations and no obligations." Beatrice nodded, too exhausted for words, and made her way upstairs to her room, where she collapsed onto the bed, still fully clothed, her body aching and her eyes burning and her throat raw, but feeling for the first time since Edmund's death like she had taken a full breath, like air was finally reaching parts of her that had been oxygen-starved for 3 years. She slept then, a deep, dreamless sleep of absolute exhaustion, and when she woke 8 hours later to find the sun beginning its descent toward evening, she lay still for a long moment, taking inventory of how she felt, and she realized with something like wonder that the crushing pressure in her chest had eased, that the constant anxiety that had been her companion for months had quieted to a manageable hum, that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship to her grief through the simple act of finally allowing herself to feel it. On the table beside her bed she found a tray with tea and sandwiches, long cold but clearly left there while she slept, and another note in Sebastian's handwriting that read simply, "You did well today. Rest as long as you need. There is no rush to perform normalcy. You are allowed to be exactly as you are." Beatrice picked up the note and read it 3 times, feeling tears threaten again. But these were different tears. Not the violent grief of the morning, but something gentler, something that felt almost like relief or perhaps gratitude, and she understood that the Duke of Ashford had not been begging for her tears in the way the title suggested romantic longing, but rather he had been advocating for them, insisting on them, creating space for them because he understood with the clarity of his own experience that her tears were not the problem, but the solution, not the breakdown, but the breakthrough, not the end of her strength, but the beginning of her healing. The remaining 10 days at Ashford Manor unfolded like a careful excavation of a buried self, each day revealing another layer of the woman Beatrice had been before grief and guilt had transformed her into a performing automaton. And Sebastian proved to be an unexpectedly skilled guide through this process of emotional archaeology, creating spaces where feelings that had been forbidden for 3 years were not only permitted, but actively encouraged. On the second morning, Beatrice woke feeling a rage so pure and hot that it frightened her. Anger at Edmund for dying and leaving her alone, anger at her parents for their emotional abdication, anger at herself for failing to save him, anger at the entire world for continuing to turn when her brother lay cold in the ground, and when she came down to breakfast with this fury burning beneath her carefully maintained composure, Sebastian took one look at her face and said simply that the East Ballroom was empty and no one would hear if she needed to make noise. She did not understand at first, stood in the doorway of the vast empty ballroom with its soaring ceiling and polished floors, and felt confused about what he expected. But then he gestured to a table along the wall where he had arranged perhaps 24 old vases, chipped and cracked pieces that were no longer suitable for display, and he told her that sometimes rage needed physical expression, that sometimes the only way to release anger was to destroy something that did not matter. Beatrice looked at the vases and felt the absurdity of the suggestion, felt her ingrained propriety rebel against the idea of deliberately breaking things. But the rage inside her was building with such pressure that she thought she might explode if she did not find some outlet, and so she picked up one of the vases, a hideous green thing with a crack running down its side, and she threw it against the marble floor with all her strength. The sound of it shattering was so satisfying, so perfectly matched to the destruction she felt inside, that she immediately reached for another, and then another, and soon she was screaming as she threw them, wordless sounds of fury and grief that echoed off the ballroom walls, and Sebastian stood quietly near the door bearing witness while she destroyed every single vase and then collapsed on the floor among the shards, breathing hard and feeling somehow lighter despite the violence of the release. On the third day, the anger had burned itself out and left behind a sadness so profound that Beatrice could barely function, could barely rise from bed or dress herself or do anything but feel the weight of Edmund's absence pressing down on her like a physical force. And when she finally made her way to the library in the late afternoon, still in her dressing gown with her hair unpinned, Sebastian was waiting with a volume of poetry, and he simply began to read aloud without comment or question. He read Wordsworth and Tennyson and poets she had never heard of, verses about loss and longing and the terrible beauty of remembering those who were gone. And Beatrice sat curled in a chair by the window and wept, actually wept for the first time since that terrible day 3 years ago, tears streaming down her face without restraint or apology, and Sebastian kept reading in his steady voice, giving her grief a container and a witness without trying to stop it or fix it or tell her it would be all right. The crying lasted for hours, great gasping sobs that shook her entire body, and when she finally exhausted herself, Sebastian handed her a handkerchief and said nothing except that she should rest, and she stumbled back to her room and slept for 14 hours straight, the first truly restful sleep she had experienced in 3 years. On the 4th day came the guilt, the terrible crushing weight of self-blame that she had carried since watching Edmund fall, the irrational but unshakable belief that she should have prevented the accident somehow, should have convinced him not to ride that morning, should have been faster getting to him after he fell, should have known how to save him. And when she tried to explain this to Sebastian over breakfast, he listened carefully, and then asked her to walk with him through the manor gardens. As they walked among the rose beds and the sculpted hedges, he asked her questions with the precision of a philosopher dismantling a faulty argument, asking what specific actions she could have taken to prevent a horse from balking at a jump, asking how she could have known the future well enough to stop Edmund from riding that morning, asking what medical training she possessed that would have allowed her to repair a broken neck. And with each question he gently exposed the irrationality of her guilt, the way she had assigned herself responsibility for things entirely beyond her control. "You were his sister," Sebastian said, as they paused by a fountain where water splashed over marble cherubs. Not his keeper, not his protector, not a fortune-teller who could have predicted the accident. You were a 23-year-old woman who loved her brother and who had the misfortune to witness his death. And the only thing you failed to do was prevent the impossible, which is not actually a failure at all. Beatrice felt something shift in her understanding, felt the first small crack in the edifice of guilt she had built, and though the self-blame did not disappear entirely, she began to see it for what it was, an attempt to make sense of senseless tragedy by assigning responsibility even when none existed. But the days were not all dark emotion and cathartic release, because Sebastian seemed to understand instinctively that healing required not just processing pain, but also rediscovering joy, and he approached this task with the same thoughtful creativity he brought to everything. On the 5th day, he made her laugh with his dry observations about the absurdities of aristocratic life, telling stories about parliamentary debates that devolved into arguments about whose family lineage was more ancient, and Beatrice found herself giggling despite herself, and then laughing outright at his deadpan delivery, and then she stopped abruptly, shocked by the sound of her own genuine laughter. "I forgot I could do that," she said wonderingly. "Really laugh, not the practiced laugh I perfected for social situations, but actual laughter that comes from finding something genuinely amusing." Sebastian smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his usually serious face. "You have many more discoveries ahead," he said quietly. "You have been performing for so long that you have forgotten what your authentic responses feel like, but they are all still there, waiting to be recovered." On the 6th evening, he took her to his private observatory, a small domed room at the top of the manor's east tower that housed an impressive telescope, and he showed her the stars with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a beloved passion, pointing out constellations and explaining the mathematics of celestial mechanics. And Beatrice felt wonder for the first time in years, genuine awe at the vast beauty of the universe and her small place within it. On the 7th day, they sat together in the conservatory for 3 hours without speaking, simply existing in companionable silence while he read his philosophy texts and she attempted needlework. And the peace of that silence, the complete absence of expectation or performance, felt like a gift beyond measure. One evening in the library, surrounded by thousands of books and the warm glow of oil lamps, Beatrice found herself confessing something she had never articulated before. "I do not know who I am without the performance," she said, looking up from the book she had been pretending to read. "I have been constructing myself to meet everyone else's expectations for so long that I have no idea what I actually want or like or value. I am a collection of appropriate responses with no authentic self underneath." Sebastian set down his own book and regarded her thoughtfully. "Then we will discover it together," he said. "What do you like? Not what you are supposed to like or what brings approval from others, but what actually brings you pleasure, what makes you feel alive and engaged and present in your own life." Beatrice thought about this, really thought about it, searching her memory for moments of genuine enjoyment rather than performed appreciation, and she came up empty. "I do not know," she admitted finally. "I truly do not know what I like because I have spent so long liking what I am supposed to like that I can no longer distinguish between genuine preference and learned response." "Then let us find out," Sebastian said, with an expression of determination. "We have several more days. Let us conduct experiments. Let us try different activities and see what resonates with you authentically rather than what you have been trained to appreciate." The next morning, he set up an easel and paints in the morning room and suggested she try painting. And Beatrice approached the blank canvas with the same careful precision she brought to everything, attempting to create a proper landscape in the approved watercolor style. But the results were spectacularly terrible, her trees looking like lumpy clouds, and her attempt at perspective creating a house that appeared to be sliding off a hill. And when Sebastian looked at her work with serious concentration, and then said solemnly that it was certainly very unique, she found herself laughing at her own incompetence, genuine amusement at her complete lack of artistic talent, and the freedom to be bad at something without shame felt revolutionary. They tried riding next, Sebastian taking her to the stables and helping her mount a gentle mare. And the moment the horse began to move beneath her, Beatrice felt something wake up inside her, a visceral thrill at the speed and power and freedom of it, and she urged the mare into a canter and then a gallop across Ashford's meadows, the wind whipping her hair loose from its pins and her heart pounding with exhilaration rather than anxiety. And when she finally pulled the mare to a stop, her face flushed and her eyes bright, Sebastian was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "That," he said quietly, "that right there, that is what genuine joy looks like on your face. Remember it. Remember how it feels so you can recognize the difference between real pleasure and performed appreciation." They experimented with reading, Sebastian bringing her novels from his extensive library, and Beatrice discovered that while she had always claimed to enjoy the serious, improving literature that young ladies were supposed to appreciate, what she actually loved were adventure stories, tales of exploration and danger and triumph over adversity. And she stayed up until 3 in the morning reading a novel about Antarctic exploration, completely absorbed in a way she had never been by the moral improvement texts she had pretended to enjoy. Sebastian shared his own ongoing grief during these days, talking about his father with the complicated mixture of love and frustration that characterized their relationship, admitting that some days he still found himself angry at the old Duke for dying before they could resolve their differences. And this admission, this modeling of the reality that healing was not linear and grief did not follow a tidy progression, gave Beatrice permission to have her own setbacks. On the 8th day she woke up, and the mask went back up automatically, her face arranging itself into pleasant composure and her movements becoming careful and controlled, and at breakfast Sebastian simply said that he noticed she was performing again and asked what had triggered the retreat. Beatrice wanted to deny it, but found she could not lie to him anymore, found that his careful witnessing of her authentic self made performance feel exhausting rather than safe. And she admitted that she was frightened by how much she had revealed, frightened that if she continued to be this vulnerable, she would lose herself entirely in a different way, would become someone so raw and uncontrolled that she could never return to society. Sebastian nodded, as though he had expected this response. "Healing is not about becoming uncontrolled," he said gently. "It is about developing genuine self-regulation rather than rigid suppression. It is about learning to feel your emotions and express them appropriately rather than locking them away entirely. You will not lose yourself by being authentic. You will find yourself." She began to talk about Edmund not as a forbidden topic that had to be carefully avoided, but as a beloved brother she missed terribly, sharing stories about his enthusiasm and his kindness and his terrible jokes. And Sebastian listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he wanted to know Edmund as a person rather than simply as the source of her grief. One afternoon in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants and the humid warmth of the glass-enclosed space. Beatrice realized she was smiling, not expression number 4 or any of her practiced variations, but a genuine smile that felt crooked and uncertain on her face. A smile that came from thinking about a funny memory of Edmund trying to teach her to fish and falling into the pond himself. And when she caught sight of her reflection in the glass wall, she almost did not recognize herself. This woman with the tentative real smile and the unguarded eyes. Sebastian, who had been reading in a nearby chair, looked up and saw her expression, and something in his own face shifted, softened, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she understood in that moment that he had fallen in love with this version of her, this messy, honest, healing woman who bore little resemblance to the perfectly composed lady who had arrived at Ashford Manor 10 days ago. But he said nothing, simply returned his attention to his book as though the moment had not happened, and Beatrice felt both relief and something that might have been disappointment. Relief that he was not pressuring her toward romance when she was still discovering who she was. Disappointment that he was not pressuring her toward romance because some part of her wanted him to see her not just as a broken thing to be fixed, but as a woman worth loving. They spent the 9th evening stargazing from the manor grounds, lying on blankets in the grass while Sebastian pointed out planets and explained the mechanics of the solar system. And Beatrice felt a contentment so profound it almost frightened her, a sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she wanted to do with exactly the right person beside her, and the simplicity of that feeling, the uncomplicated rightness of it, was so foreign to her experience of the past 3 years that she almost did not trust it. On the 10th and final day before they would need to return to London, Beatrice woke early and walked through Ashford's gardens alone, thinking about the woman she had been when she arrived and the woman she was becoming. And she understood that she would never return to being the Beatrice who existed before Edmund's death. That version of herself was gone forever. But she also understood that she did not have to be the performing automaton she had constructed in the aftermath of loss. That there was a third option, a new self built from honest grief and authentic joy, and the permission to feel everything without shame. She found Sebastian in the library, as she had known she would, and she sat down across from him and said without preamble that she was terrified to return to London, terrified that the moment she stepped back into society's watchful gaze, she would revert to her old patterns of performance and suppression. He looked up from his book and regarded her with those dark, seeing eyes. "You might," he said honestly. "Old habits are powerful, and the pressure to conform to social expectations is real. But you also now know the difference between performance and authenticity. You have experienced what it feels like to be genuine, and that knowledge cannot be unlearned. It will make performing much harder because you will always know what you are sacrificing when you put on the mask." Beatrice nodded slowly, understanding the truth of this, understanding that the past 10 days had ruined her for the kind of relentless composure she had maintained for 3 years, had given her a taste of genuine living that would make mere performing feel like slow death. "Will you help me?" she asked quietly. "When I slip back into old patterns, will you call me out the way you have been doing here? Will you be the person who sees me and refuses to let me disappear behind the smile?" "Always," Sebastian said simply. "For as long as you want me to. I will be the person who sees you and who reminds you that you deserve to be seen." And in that moment, sitting in the library of Ashford Manor with morning light streaming through tall windows and the weight of 10 days of healing settling into her bones, Beatrice Fairfax understood that she had fallen in love with Sebastian Tilney. Not from gratitude, though she was grateful. not from dependence, though he had certainly helped her, but from the deep recognition that came from being truly known by another person and choosing to know them in return, from witnessing his vulnerability and having him witness hers, from the slow building of intimacy that came not from performance or courtship rituals, but from the honest sharing of broken places and the careful tending of each other's healing. The morning of their return to London dawned grey and drizzling, as though the weather itself mourned the end of Beatrice's sanctuary at Ashford Manor, and she stood at her bedroom window watching rain streak down the glass while Agnes packed her trunks with the efficient movements of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. The fortnight that had felt both endless and impossibly brief was over, and in a few hours she would step back into the world that had required her constant performance for 3 years, back into her mother's house and society's expectations, and the relentless pressure to be the perfectly composed Miss Fairfax who never showed unseemly emotion or burdened others with her grief. She felt terror rising in her throat at the prospect, felt the old familiar urge to begin practicing expressions in the mirror and planning her performances and rebuilding the armor she had so carefully dismantled over the past 10 days. But she also felt something new, a stubborn determination not to disappear again, not to sacrifice the authentic self she had worked so hard to recover. Sebastian had arranged for their carriages to travel together back to London, Mrs. Gardiner dozing in Beatrice's carriage while Sebastian rode in his own, and though propriety prevented them from travelling together, knowing he was nearby provided an anchor that kept Beatrice from spiralling into complete panic. They stopped for luncheon at a coaching inn halfway to London, and Sebastian found a private moment to ask her how she was managing the prospect of returning to society, his dark eyes searching her face for signs of the mask going back up. "I am terrified," Beatrice admitted, because honesty had become easier than performance over the past days, terrified that the moment I walk into my mother's house, I will become that other Beatrice, again, the one who smiles pleasantly while dying inside, terrified that these 10 days will feel like a beautiful dream that has no connection to my actual life. "It will be difficult," Sebastian said, not bothering to offer false reassurance. "You will be tempted to perform, the old patterns will reassert themselves, but you now know the difference between authentic and false, and that knowledge will make choosing the mask much harder because you will feel the cost more acutely." Beatrice nodded, understanding the truth of this, and she asked the question that had been haunting her since they had begun packing. "Will you be there, at the ball tonight? Will you be the person who sees me and helps me stay honest when the pressure to perform becomes overwhelming?" "I will be there," Sebastian promised, "and I will be watching, not to judge, but to witness, not to demand anything but to remind you that you have choices, that you do not have to sacrifice yourself to make others comfortable." They arrived at the Fairfax townhouse in the late afternoon to find it in a state of controlled chaos, servants rushing about with final preparations for the evening's grand ball, her mother directing traffic with the frantic energy of someone whose social standing depends on perfect execution, and Lady Fairfax barely paused in her instructions to the florist before turning to Beatrice with an expression that managed to combine relief at her return with irritation at her timing. "Beatrice, darling, you have returned just in time," Lady Fairfax said, her voice carrying the strained cheerfulness of someone under enormous stress. "I do hope your fortnight in the country was restorative, because tonight you must be at your best. I have invited several extremely eligible gentlemen specifically for you, Lord Pemberton and Mr. Ashworth and Sir Geoffrey Hampton, all of whom have expressed interest in making you an offer if you would only show the slightest encouragement." Beatrice felt something cold settle in her stomach, the realization that her mother had planned this ball not just as a social triumph, but as a marriage market, had arranged for her daughter to be paraded before potential suitors like goods to be purchased. and the old Beatrice would have smiled pleasantly and agreed to perform the role assigned to her. But the new Beatrice, who had spent 10 days learning to feel her feelings, found that she could not simply smile and nod. "Mother," she said carefully, "I have only just returned, and I am quite tired from the journey. Perhaps we might discuss expectations for this evening at a later time." "Nonsense," Lady Fairfax replied, waving away this objection with an imperious hand. "You have had 2 weeks to rest. Surely you can manage a few hours of pleasant conversation with gentlemen who are kind enough to show interest. Now go upstairs and have Agnes dress you in the rose silk. It is most becoming, and will show to advantage in the ballroom lighting." Beatrice opened her mouth to argue, to say that she did not want to be shown to advantage, or to encourage proposals from men who saw her as a pleasant ornament rather than a complete person. But her mother had already turned back to the florist, dismissing any possibility of discussion. And Beatrice felt the familiar pattern reasserting itself, felt herself beginning to retreat into compliance and performance rather than risking conflict. But then she felt a hand on her arm, light and steadying, and turned to find Sebastian standing just behind her, his presence a reminder of everything she had learned about authentic living. And she took a breath and made a choice. "Actually, Mother," she said, her voice stronger now, "I will wear the blue silk that I prefer, and I will not be encouraging marriage proposals this evening. I am recently returned from processing my grief, and I am not prepared to make decisions about my future while still learning who I am in the present." Lady Fairfax turned back with an expression of shock that would have been comical if it were not so painful, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly for a moment before she recovered her composure. "We will discuss this later," she said icily, "when you are not overtired from travel and speaking nonsense. Now please go prepare yourself for this evening, and do try to remember that the family's reputation depends on your comportment." Beatrice felt the familiar guilt rising, the conditioned response to her mother's disapproval. But she also felt Sebastian's presence behind her, and remembered his words about how she did not have to sacrifice herself to make others comfortable. And she simply nodded and went upstairs without arguing further, understanding that some battles were best fought through quiet persistence rather than direct confrontation. Agnes dressed her in the blue silk, despite Lady Fairfax's explicit instructions otherwise, and Beatrice looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, someone who looked simultaneously more vulnerable and more powerful than the perfectly composed Miss Fairfax who had existed before Ashford Manor, someone whose face showed evidence of recent crying and genuine emotion rather than practiced expressions. The ball began at 8 o'clock, and Beatrice stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at the glittering assembly in the ballroom below. Hundreds of London's finest families gathered in their silks and jewels, the chandeliers blazing with candlelight, the orchestra playing Mozart, everything arranged to create an impression of wealth and taste and social significance. And she felt anxiety tighten around her chest like a vice. This was the world that had required her constant performance, the world that had praised her composure and called her wonderfully steady while she slowly died inside, and stepping back into it felt like stepping into a trap that would close around her the moment she descended the stairs. But she also saw Sebastian in the ballroom below, standing near the windows in his dark evening clothes, and he looked up as though feeling her gaze, and gave her the smallest nod, a gesture of encouragement and recognition, and she felt her spine straighten with determination. She descended the stairs and entered the ballroom, and immediately her mother was there with Lord Pemberton in tow, a gentleman of perhaps 40, with a receding hairline and an air of vague pompousness, and Lady Fairfax performed introductions with excessive enthusiasm, while clearly expecting Beatrice to deploy her most charming expressions. "Lord Pemberton, how delightful to see you again," Beatrice said, and she could hear in her own voice that the words were honest rather than performed. Could hear that she was not deploying expression number 12, but was actually speaking from genuine, if mild, pleasure at seeing someone familiar. Lord Pemberton launched into a monologue about his estates in Yorkshire, clearly expecting Beatrice to respond with appropriate expressions of admiration and interest, and the old Beatrice would have maintained perfect attention and asked leading questions, and made him feel fascinating. But the new Beatrice found her attention wandering and did not fight it, found herself looking around the ballroom at other guests and only half listening to his description of crop rotation and tenant management. "Miss Fairfax," Lord Pemberton said, his tone sharp with offence, "I do not believe you are attending to my conversation." "I apologize," Beatrice said, and she meant it genuinely. "I find I am somewhat distracted this evening, and agricultural management is not a topic that holds my interest. Perhaps you might find a more engaged conversational partner among the other guests." Lord Pemberton looked affronted, clearly unaccustomed to young women admitting disinterest in his monologues, and he excused himself with barely concealed irritation while Lady Fairfax stared at her daughter with horror. "What are you doing?" her mother hissed. "That man has 10,000 a year and was clearly prepared to make you an offer. You cannot simply tell him you find him boring." "I did not say I found him boring," Beatrice corrected gently. "I said agricultural management does not interest me, which is true, and I would rather be honest than perform interest. I do not feel only to encourage a proposal from a man I do not love." "You are being ridiculous," Lady Fairfax snapped. "Love is a luxury. Security is what matters. Now compose yourself and go speak with Mr. Ashworth. He is near the refreshment table, and I specifically told him you would seek him out." Beatrice felt anger rising, genuine anger at being treated like a commodity rather than a person, at having her mother prioritize social advancement over her daughter's emotional well-being, and rather than suppressing this anger as she had for years, she let herself feel it fully. "No, Mother," she said quietly but firmly. "I will not seek out Mr. Ashworth, or any other gentleman you have selected for me. I will spend this evening as I choose, dancing with whom I please and conversing about topics that interest me. And if that embarrasses you, then I am sorry, but I will not return to performing a version of myself that slowly killed me over 3 years." Lady Fairfax went pale, her hand rising to her throat in a gesture of shock, and for a moment Beatrice thought her mother might actually listen, might actually hear what she was saying, but then Lady Fairfax's expression hardened into familiar disapproval. "You are overtired from your travels and saying things you will regret," she said coldly. "We will discuss your behavior tomorrow when you are more yourself. For now, please try not to embarrass the family further." The evening progressed, and Beatrice moved through it with a strange mixture of anxiety and liberation, feeling her genuine emotions in real time rather than suppressing them beneath practiced expressions. When she passed Edmund's portrait in the hallway, the painting that showed him at 16 with his bright smile and eager eyes, she felt sadness wash over her, and rather than hiding it, she simply stood there looking at her brother's face while tears ran down her cheeks, and several guests witnessed this display of emotion and whispered to each other with expressions ranging from sympathy to scandalized disapproval. Lady Whitmore, a woman who had praised Beatrice's composure countless times over the past 3 years, approached her near the portrait and said with the thoughtless cruelty of someone who believes they are being helpful that it was time to move on from tragedy, that dwelling on the past was unhealthy, that Edmund would want her to be happy rather than sad. Beatrice turned to face Lady Whitmore and felt words rising that she had suppressed for 3 years. "My brother's death is not something to move on from," she said quietly but clearly, her voice carrying in the suddenly silent hallway. "It is something I am learning to carry, learning to live with, learning to honor, by allowing myself to grieve honestly rather than performing recovery to make others comfortable. And if my sadness makes you uncomfortable, then I suggest you avoid the portrait rather than demanding I hide my feelings." The silence in the hallway was absolute, every guest within earshot frozen in various attitudes of shock, and Lady Whitmore's face went red with embarrassment and offence before she turned and walked quickly away. Beatrice's mother, who had witnessed the entire exchange from across the hall, looked absolutely horrified, her carefully planned social triumph dissolving into scandal as her daughter publicly rejected the emotional suppression that polite society demanded. But Beatrice also noticed something else. Noticed 3 women approaching her slowly, cautiously, their faces showing a mixture of nervousness and relief. And the first woman, a Mrs. Burton whom Beatrice knew only slightly, said in a voice barely above a whisper that she had lost her father 6 months ago, and everyone kept telling her to move on, and she was so tired of pretending she was fine when she was not fine at all. The second woman, Miss Caroline Reed, said her younger sister had died in childbirth last year, and no one ever mentioned her anymore, as though speaking of the dead was somehow improper, and she was grateful to hear someone acknowledge that grief was not something to be overcome, but something to be carried. The third woman, Lady Hastings, said her son had been killed in a riding accident, and for 2 years she had maintained perfect composure at social events while dying inside. And seeing Beatrice speak honestly about her loss gave her permission to consider that perhaps she too deserved to grieve openly. Beatrice spoke with these women for nearly an hour, standing in that hallway beneath Edmund's portrait, and she understood that her honesty had created space for their honesty, that her refusal to perform recovery had given them permission to acknowledge their own ongoing grief, and this felt more important than any social triumph her mother had planned. Sebastian found her in the garden later, when the ball was winding down, and most guests had moved on to other conversations, and she was standing among the roses in the same spot where months ago he had witnessed her near breakdown and offered his uncomfortable observation that she was in pain. "You were magnificent in there," Sebastian said quietly, moving to stand beside her without touching, maintaining the respectful distance that had characterized their entire relationship. "I was honest," Beatrice replied, her voice tired but not defeated. "People hated it. My mother is furious. I have likely destroyed any remaining marriage prospects I might have had, and I embarrassed my family in front of half of London society." "Some people hated it," Sebastian agreed. "But did you notice 3 other women came up to you afterward? Women who have lost brothers, fathers, children. You gave them permission to acknowledge their pain. You showed them that honest grief is not shameful. And that is worth more than any marriage proposal from men who want a pleasant ornament rather than a complete person." "I do not want to be the sad girl forever, though," Beatrice said, turning to face him. "I do not want my entire identity to be defined by loss and grief. I want to be more than Edmund's sister who never recovered." "You are not," Sebastian said, his dark eyes holding hers with absolute conviction. "You are not the sad girl. You are the honest girl, the brave girl, the girl who feels everything and is not afraid of it anymore, the girl who stood in a ballroom full of judgment and chose authenticity over approval. And that is who you are becoming. Someone defined not by loss, but by courage." Beatrice felt something warm bloom in her chest, felt the truth of his words settling into her bones. And she understood that the past 10 days had not been about returning to who she was before Edmund's death, but about discovering who she could become after it, about building a new self from honest emotion and authentic living rather than practiced performance. The ball continued inside without her, her mother's grand social triumph proceeding despite her daughter's shocking display of genuine feeling. and Beatrice stood in the garden with Sebastian beside her, and felt more herself than she had in 3 years, felt more alive in her honesty than she had ever felt in her performance. And she made a choice in that moment to continue choosing authenticity even when it was difficult, even when it disappointed others, even when it meant standing alone against society's demands for pleasant composure. She would not be the perfectly composed Miss Fairfax anymore, would not rate her daily performances or practice expressions in the mirror or suppress her emotions to make others comfortable. She would be messy and honest and healing. She would feel her feelings and speak her truth and allow herself to be seen in all her complicated humanity. And if that meant disappointing her mother and shocking society and remaining unmarried forever, then so be it, because she had learned at Ashford Manor that a life lived authentically, even if it was difficult, was infinitely preferable to a life lived in pleasant performance while slowly dying inside. The morning after the ball, Beatrice woke to find a note slipped under her door in Sebastian's familiar handwriting requesting a private audience that afternoon in the drawing room, the same formal space where 2 weeks ago he had shared his own story of breakdown and offered her sanctuary at Ashford Manor, and she felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness as she tried to imagine what he might want to discuss. Her mother had not spoken to her since the previous night's shocking display of genuine emotion, had simply retreated to her own chambers with a headache and left Beatrice to face the morning alone, and this silence felt both punishing and relieving. Punishing because Beatrice still craved her mother's approval, even as she chose to live without it, relieving because she had no energy left for defending her choices or explaining her transformation. She spent the morning in her room reading one of the adventure novels she had discovered she loved at Ashford, losing herself in tales of Antarctic exploration while Agnes moved quietly about the space, tidying and organizing. And when the appointed hour approached, Beatrice found herself checking her reflection in the mirror, not to practice expressions, but simply to see who looked back at her. And she was pleased to find a woman whose face showed evidence of recent emotional upheaval, but also a new kind of peace, someone who looked tired but authentic, vulnerable but strong. Sebastian was already waiting in the drawing room when she arrived, standing by the window in afternoon, light that illuminated the fine lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair, and he turned when she entered with an expression that made her breath catch, something intense and tender, and almost nervous in his usually composed features. "Miss Fairfax," he said, and then he stopped and shook his head slightly. "Beatrice, if I may be permitted the familiarity after everything we have shared, I asked you here today because there is something I need to tell you, something I have been holding back during your healing process, because the timing was not right, but which I can no longer keep silent." Beatrice felt her heart pounding as she moved further into the room, settling into the same chair she had occupied 2 weeks ago when he had told her about his own breakdown, and she folded her hands in her lap, not to create composure, but simply because she needed something to do with them while nervous energy coursed through her body. "I have spent the past weeks watching you transform," Sebastian continued, his voice quiet but carrying absolute conviction. "Watching you break open and begin to heal. Watching you discover who you are beneath the performance you constructed for survival. And in the process of witnessing that transformation, I have fallen completely and irrevocably in love with you." Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes immediately, genuine tears of surprise and joy and relief, and she made no attempt to hide them or blink them away, simply let them fall while she absorbed his words. "But I need you to understand," Sebastian said, moving closer but still maintaining respectful distance, "that I did not fall in love with the perfectly composed Miss Fairfax who attended charity luncheons with practiced smiles. I fell in love with the woman who cried so violently in the rose garden that she made herself sick. I fell in love with your tears, every one of them, because they meant you were finally feeling again, finally allowing yourself to be human rather than performing humanity." He paused, and Beatrice saw his own eyes growing bright with emotion, saw him allowing himself the same vulnerability he had created space for in her. "But I also fell in love with your laughter when you discovered you were terrible at painting," he continued, his voice rough now. "I fell in love with your genuine smile when you talked about Edmund without shame. I fell in love with your anger when you smashed vases in the ballroom. I fell in love with your wonder when you looked through my telescope at the stars. I fell in love with your messy, beautiful, honest heart and every complicated emotion that lives within it." Beatrice was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face, and she felt joy rising in her chest, so intense it was almost painful, felt the recognition of being truly loved, not despite her pain but through it, not in spite of her emotional mess, but because of her willingness to feel everything authentically. "I love you," Sebastian said, taking another step closer. "I love all of you, the parts that still grieve, and the parts that are learning to heal, the parts that struggle, and the parts that triumph. And I want to spend my life bearing witness to all of it, being the person who sees you and loves you exactly as you are." Beatrice stood on trembling legs, moving toward him without conscious decision, drawn by the gravity of his honesty and his love. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, but steady in its conviction. "I love you for seeing me when I had made myself invisible, for refusing to accept my performance when everyone else was applauding it, for creating space for my feelings without trying to fix them or make them easier, for teaching me that vulnerability is not weakness, but the foundation of genuine connection." Sebastian reached out and gently wiped tears from her cheeks with his thumbs, his touch careful and reverent, and Beatrice leaned into his hands feeling more seen and more loved than she had ever felt in her life. "I want to marry you," Sebastian said, his dark eyes holding hers. "But I need you to understand that I am not proposing to save you or fix you. You have done that yourself through your own courage and work. I want to marry you because you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and I want to build a life with you, a life where we both feel everything and hide nothing, where we bear witness to each other's joy and pain, where we choose authenticity over performance every single day, even when it is difficult." Beatrice felt fresh tears rising, felt her heart so full it seemed impossible that her chest could contain it, and she said yes, without hesitation, without calculation, without any of the careful consideration she had once believed should govern such important decisions, said yes because her heart knew this was right, even if her mind could not fully articulate all the reasons why. "I used to think," Beatrice said after a long moment of simply standing in his arms, "that to be loved I had to be perfect, that any crack in my composure would make me unlovable, that I had to earn affection through flawless performance and never burden anyone with my actual feelings." "And now?" Sebastian asked gently, his hand stroking her hair. "Now I know that the cracks are where the light gets in," she said, remembering a line from one of the poetry books he had given her. "And you taught me to stop being afraid of breaking, taught me that being seen in my brokenness is more valuable than being admired for my composure." "You taught yourself," Sebastian corrected gently. "I just held the space for you to do it. You are the one who had the courage to feel and to change and to choose authenticity, even when everyone around you demanded performance." They stood together in that drawing room for a long time, holding each other while afternoon light moved across the floor and the sounds of London filtered through the windows, and Beatrice felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with the absence of difficult emotions and everything to do with the presence of someone who loved her through all of them. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in a small chapel near Ashford Manor, not the grand cathedral affair that Lady Fairfax had envisioned for her daughter, but an intimate gathering of close friends and family who had earned the right to witness their union through genuine care rather than social obligation. Beatrice had invited the 3 women who had approached her at the ball after her honest conversation with Lady Whitmore, had invited Agnes, who had watched over her through 3 years of practiced smiling, had invited Sebastian's small household staff, who had created the sanctuary where her healing began, and the chapel was filled not with hundreds of society's finest, but with perhaps 40 people who actually knew them and loved them. The morning of the wedding, Beatrice stood before her mirror not to practice expressions but simply to take in the woman she had become, dressed in a gown of cream silk, chosen because she loved it rather than because it was fashionable, her hair arranged simply with flowers from Ashford's garden woven through the curls, and she felt nervous and joyful and sad and hopeful all at once, felt the full range of human emotion without trying to suppress any of it. She missed Edmund with an ache that would never fully disappear, wished he could be there to walk her down the aisle and make inappropriate jokes about her finally finding someone willing to marry her, and she let herself feel that sadness without shame, let tears slide down her cheeks while Agnes fastened her veil. Her father appeared at her door looking uncomfortable in his formal attire, and when he saw her tears, his first instinct was clearly to retreat, to avoid the emotional complexity of the moment. But Beatrice reached for his hand and said quietly that she was crying because she was happy and sad at the same time, because Edmund should be here and was not, because she was about to marry a man she loved desperately and beginning a new chapter of her life. Her father, who had spent 3 years hiding from his own grief in his study, looked at his daughter's tear-stained face and seemed to see her for the first time in years, seemed to recognize in her honest emotion something he had been denying himself, and his own eyes grew bright. "He would have been happy for you," Lord Fairfax said roughly, his voice catching on the words. "Edmund would have liked the Duke, would have approved of a man who clearly sees what an extraordinary woman you are." They walked down the aisle together, and Beatrice's face showed everything she was feeling, joy and nervousness and love, and a flicker of sadness at her brother's absence and hope for the future, all of it visible and unashamed. And when she caught sight of Sebastian waiting at the altar, his own eyes were bright with tears. She reached him and her father, stepped back, and Sebastian looked at her tear-stained face and smiled with such love that Beatrice felt her breath catch. "There you are," he whispered, taking her hands in his. "All of you, every beautiful, complicated feeling written on your face, and I have never seen anything more perfect than your willingness to be completely present in this moment." The ceremony proceeded, and Beatrice cried through most of it, not delicate decorative tears, but real tears that required her to pause and collect herself. Tears of joy this time, but tears nonetheless. Genuine emotion that she made no attempt to hide or apologize for. And Sebastian cried too, his own tears falling freely as they exchanged vows that promised not just love, but witness, not just companionship, but authentic connection, not just support in easy times, but presence through difficult ones. When they kissed as husband and wife, Beatrice tasted salt from both their tears, felt the wetness on both their faces, and she thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, who believed that tears were weakness and that love required perfection. And she felt profound gratitude for the breakdown that had allowed breakthrough, for the man who had refused to accept her performance and had instead begged for her truth. The small gathering celebrated with genuine joy, no grand ball with hundreds of guests performing social rituals, but an intimate dinner where conversation flowed easily and laughter came frequently. and Beatrice found herself surrounded by people who knew her story and loved her, not despite it, but through it. People who had witnessed her transformation and celebrated her courage to feel everything authentically. Lady Fairfax attended, still somewhat disapproving of her daughter's emotional honesty, but softened slightly by the obvious love between Beatrice and Sebastian, and toward the end of the evening she approached her daughter with an expression that suggested she was trying to understand even if she could not fully approve. "You seem happy," Lady Fairfax said carefully. "Genuinely happy in a way I have not seen since before Edmund died. And I suppose that is what matters, even if I do not entirely understand this new manner of yours, this insistence on showing every feeling rather than maintaining proper composure." "I am happy," Beatrice confirmed gently. "Happier than I have been in 3 years. And I am also sometimes sad, and sometimes angry, and sometimes anxious. I feel everything now instead of suppressing everything, and it is messy and complicated, but it is real, and real is better than the alternative." Her mother nodded slowly, clearly still processing this philosophy that contradicted everything she had been taught about appropriate emotional management, and while Beatrice knew her mother would likely never fully understand her choices, she had stopped needing that understanding, had learned that she could love her mother while also living differently than her mother would prefer. 1 year later, on what would have been Edmund's 27th birthday, Beatrice woke in the master chambers at Ashford Manor with tears already streaming down her face, the grief of his absence hitting her with the same force it had on the first anniversary and the second, and would likely hit her on every future birthday he would not celebrate. Sebastian, who had learned to recognize the signs of her grief days, simply pulled her closer and held her while she cried, offering no words of comfort or attempts to fix her pain, just his steady presence and his willingness to bear witness to her sorrow. They spent the day quietly, Beatrice moving through waves of grief that came and receded like tides, sometimes crying and sometimes laughing as she told Sebastian stories about Edmund that she had not shared before, and toward evening they visited the cemetery where Edmund was buried, bringing flowers and sitting beside his grave, while Beatrice talked to her brother about the year that had passed and the life she was building. On the good days, which were increasingly frequent, Beatrice laughed freely and loved deeply and engaged with life with an intensity that came from knowing how precious and fragile it all was, how quickly it could be taken away, and she had started a small charity that offered support to grieving families, creating spaces where people could express their pain without judgment and learn that feelings were not weakness, but the very essence of being human. She held monthly gatherings where people who had lost loved ones could come together and speak honestly about their grief, could cry without apology and rage without shame, and slowly learn to carry their losses in ways that allowed for continued living. And she found profound meaning in this work, in creating for others the kind of witness and permission that Sebastian had created for her. Her relationship with her mother remained complicated, Lady Fairfax never quite understanding why Beatrice insisted on this excessive emotional honesty when pleasant composure had served their family well for generations. But Beatrice had learned to accept her mother's limitations without letting them limit her own growth, had learned to love Lady Fairfax while also recognizing that some people would never understand the path she had chosen, and that was acceptable. On an autumn evening, a year after their wedding, Beatrice and Sebastian sat in the library at Ashford Manor, the same room where so much of her healing had occurred, and she was reading aloud from an adventure novel while he pretended to work on estate accounts, but was actually just watching her with the expression of complete contentment that had become his default whenever she was near. She looked up from her book and caught him watching, and she smiled, not expression number 4 or any other practiced variation, but her genuine smile that was crooked and tentative and absolutely beautiful in its authenticity. "What are you thinking?" she asked, setting down her book. "I am thinking," Sebastian said, moving to sit beside her, "that I am the most fortunate man alive because I get to spend every day with a woman brave enough to feel everything, brave enough to cry when she is sad and laugh when she is happy and rage when she is angry, brave enough to be completely and honestly herself without apology or performance." "I am thinking," Beatrice said, taking his hand, "that I am grateful every day that you saw me when I had made myself invisible, that you refused to accept my pleasant mask and instead begged for my tears, understanding that they were not weakness, but the path to genuine living." They sat together in the warm lamplight, two people who had found each other not through the traditional rituals of courtship and performance, but through the messy, honest work of being seen and seeing in return, through the courage to feel deeply and love authentically, and build a life based on truth rather than appearance. And Beatrice understood with absolute certainty that this honest connection built on mutual witness and authentic emotion, was worth more than all the perfect composure and social approval in the world. She had spent 3 years practicing smiling to hide her sadness. 3 years believing that to be loved she had to be perfect. 3 years slowly dying beneath a mask of pleasant composure. And it had taken a duke who begged for her tears, who saw her pain and refused to let her hide it, who understood that vulnerability was not weakness, but the foundation of genuine intimacy, to teach her that the path to joy ran straight through the center of grief, that the only way to truly live was to truly feel, that the cracks in her composure were not flaws to be hidden, but openings where light could enter and love could grow. And now, sitting in the library of Ashford Manor with Sebastian beside her and the rest of her life stretching ahead, Beatrice finally understood what it meant to be whole, not through the absence of pain, but through the willingness to feel it, not through perfect control, but through authentic expression, not through hiding her tears, but through allowing them to fall freely, knowing that each one was evidence not of weakness, but of her profound courage to be completely, messily, beautifully human.